What if the greatest empire builders of the ancient world were not the ones who conquered with swords alone, but those who connected distant lands through the quiet persistence of merchants, camels, and shared ideas? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always nice to know where everyone is drifting off to sleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the rugged landscapes of Central Asia during the 2nd century before the Common Era, a network of trails and mountain passes began to link the settled civilizations at either end of the known world. The land itself shaped the early movements. High plateaus gave way to arid deserts, while river valleys offered rare stretches of green where travellers could rest their animals and refill water skins. People had crossed parts of these routes for centuries in small groups, trading local goods like jade or horses, but something larger started to take shape when the Han dynasty in China looked westward for new allies and resources. The Han Emperor Wu Di faced ongoing threats from nomadic groups on the northern borders. These horsemen moved quickly across the steppes, raiding settled communities and disrupting farming areas. To counter them, the emperor sent an envoy named Jiang Qian on a long mission in 138 BCE. Jiang Qian travelled for more than a decade, enduring capture, escape and harsh conditions. His reports brought back details about distant kingdoms, including the Fergana Valley known for its strong horses that could improve the Chinese cavalry. Those accounts helped open regular contact between the Han court and regions further west. Merchants soon followed the paths that diplomats and soldiers had scouted. They carried bundles of Chinese silk, a fabric so fine and lightweight that it became prized in places where wool and linen were common. In return, they brought back goods that the Chinese courts valued, such as grapes, alfalfa, and new breeds of livestock. The exchange was practical at first. Silk was lightweight and compact, easy to transport over long distances without spoiling. Camels proved ideal for the desert stretches because they could go days without water and carry heavy loads. Local rulers along the route saw opportunities in this growing traffic. They set up small way stations where travellers could find shelter, food, and protection for a fee. These stops often grew into modest settlements, with markets that sold supplies and allowed goods to change hands multiple times before reaching their final destinations. The movement of people also spread practical knowledge. Techniques for irrigating dry fields or breeding better pack animals moved along with the caravans. By the 1st century BCE, the routes had stabilized enough that regular caravans made the journey from the Chinese frontier towns like Dunhuang to the oasis cities further west. The Han government supported this by establishing military garrisons at key points to reduce bandit attacks. Soldiers stationed there also helped maintain watchtowers and signal systems using smoke or flags during daylight and fires at night. The cultural atmosphere of that time reflected a mix of settled farming societies and mobile nomadic groups. In China, the Han period brought a focus on Confucian ideas of order and scholarship alongside practical administration. Further west, in the areas around the Tarim Basin, small kingdoms thrived on controlling passes through the mountains. Their people spoke different languages and followed various local beliefs, but they all benefited from the safe passage of goods. Trade items included more than silk. Chinese iron tools and lacquerware travelled outward, while Western glass beads, furs and spices came eastward. The volume remained modest compared to later centuries, but the pattern was set. Each caravan represented a chain of decisions by individuals who calculated risks against potential profits. A merchant might start with a small investment in silk bolts, sell them at an oasis for horses or gems, then use those to buy other items for the next leg. The physical demands of the journey were constant. Travellers crossed the Taklamakan Desert, where sandstorms could erase paths and where water sources were few. They learned to travel in larger groups for safety and to time their movements with the seasons to avoid the worst heat or winter snows in the mountain passes. Animals needed careful management. Camels required grazing areas at regular intervals, and horses needed grain supplements when forage was scarce. Jiang Qian's mission had shown that the world beyond the Chinese borders was not empty or hostile in every direction. It contained organized states with their own rulers, armies, and markets. This knowledge encouraged more expeditions. Over time, the Han extended their influence westward through a series of alliances and occasional military campaigns. They established protectorates over some oasis states, which helped secure the flow of goods. The early Silk Road was never a single paved highway. It consisted of several parallel routes that split and rejoined depending on conditions. Northern paths skirted the edges of the steppe, while southern ones followed the foothills of the Kunlun Mountains. Travellers chose their path based on reports from previous groups about water availability or political stability in particular areas. In the west, the Parthian Empire controlled territories that included important trading hubs like Merv. Parthian rulers maintained order along their stretches of the route and collected taxes on goods passing through. They also facilitated exchanges with the Roman world further west, though direct contact between Han, China and Rome remained rare. Most goods changed hands many times before reaching the Mediterranean. The human side of these early connections involved ordinary people adapting to new opportunities. A farmer in a Chinese village might produce extra silk for sale to a passing trader. A nomad herder could earn money by guiding caravans through familiar territory. An oasis dweller might learn a few words of a foreign language to bargain more effectively. These small interactions built the foundation for larger cultural exchanges that would develop later. As the 1st century BCE drew to a close, the routes had become reliable enough that ideas and technologies began to travel alongside the physical goods. Methods of papermaking or sericulture remained closely guarded in China for a time, but other knowledge spread more freely. Astronomical observations or medical practices from different regions found new audiences. The era's atmosphere was one of cautious expansion. Rulers focused on securing their borders and ensuring steady revenue from trade. Merchants operated with a blend of caution and ambition, knowing that a successful journey could bring wealth, but that losses from raids or accidents were always possible. Travellers carried stories of distant lands, which they shared around campfires at night. These tales helped shape how people imagined the wider world. The Silk Road's first threads were fragile at the beginning. They depended on stable political conditions, reliable water sources, and the willingness of different groups to allow passage. Yet those threads held and gradually strengthened as more people saw the benefits of keeping the routes open. The movement of goods created incentives for cooperation even among groups that had little else in common. By the time the Han dynasty faced internal challenges in the 1st century CE, the basic framework of long-distance trade across Central Asia was established. The routes would shift and adapt with changing powers, but the core idea of connecting east and west through overland paths had taken root. This network would influence the course of history for many centuries by allowing the exchange of material goods and, just as importantly, the sharing of knowledge and customs among distant societies, Han expansion and the oasis kingdoms. The Han court continued to strengthen its hold on the western regions after the initial missions proved successful. Emperor Wudi authorized further expeditions that pushed Chinese influence deeper into the Tarim Basin. Garrisons were placed at strategic points such as Lulan and Khotan, where soldiers helped maintain order and collected information about local affairs. These outposts served as supply points for caravans heading further west, offering stored grain and repaired equipment. Local rulers in the oasis settlements adapted to the new presence. Some formed alliances with the Han through marriage ties or tribute payments, which brought them protection against raids from nomadic groups. Others resisted at first, but eventually accepted the benefits of regular trade traffic that passed through their territories. The kingdoms of Shanshan and Yutian, for example, controlled key water sources and mountain passes. Their leaders managed markets where goods from China were exchanged for local products like jade and fine wool. Caravans grew in size during this period. A typical group might include dozens of merchants, guides, and armed escorts travelling with hundreds of camels and horses. They followed established schedules tied to the seasons, departing after the spring thaw and aiming to reach major stops before winter set in. The journey from the Chinese frontier to the Pamir Mountains could take several months, with stops every few days at wells or small villages. Trade goods became more varied. In addition to silk, Chinese merchants carried mirrors, pottery and spices that had reached China from southern ports. From the west came silverware, precious stones, and new crop seeds that Chinese farmers tested in their fields. The movement created a chain of economic activity. A bolt of silk sold in an oasis might be traded for a string of beads, which then bought leather goods further along the line. Profits accumulated at each step, encouraging more participants. The cultural mix in the oasis kingdoms reflected their position as meeting points. People spoke languages from the Indo-European family, alongside those influenced by Chinese administration. Religious practices included local spirit worship mixed with emerging Buddhist ideas that had begun to travel eastward from India. Monks sometimes accompanied caravans, carrying texts and small statues that found new homes in cave temples carved into cliffs near Dunhuang. Han officials introduced administrative systems in the areas under their control. They appointed protectors who oversaw tax collection and dispute resolution. Records were kept on wooden slips or early paper, noting the passage of caravans and the types of goods carried. These documents provide a glimpse into daily operations, such as the number of animals in a group or the names of merchants from different regions. Nomadic groups on the fringes continued to interact with the settled areas. Some offered horses and furs in exchange for grain and metal tools. Others served as guides or provided protection for a share of the profits. The relationship was not always peaceful, but periods of stability allowed trade to flourish. The Xiongnu Confederation, which had pressured the Han borders earlier, gradually lost influence as Chinese forces pushed them further north. Agricultural techniques spread along the routes. Farmers in the oases learned new methods for growing wheat and millet using irrigation channels fed by mountain streams. In return, knowledge of grape cultivation moved eastward and took root in Chinese vineyards. These exchanges improved food supplies for both travellers and local populations, supporting larger settlements. By the late 1st century BCE, the Han had established a protectorate over much of the Tarim Basin. This arrangement brought relative security to the main routes. Merchants from as far as Bactria in the west began to make regular trips, bringing goods produced under Greek-influenced styles that had lingered after Alexander the Great's campaigns centuries earlier. Coins from different mints circulated, showing the economic ties that crossed political boundaries. Life in the oasis towns followed a steady rhythm. Markets opened at dawn with calls from vendors selling fresh dates, bread, and dried meats. Travellers rested in simple hostels built of mud bricks, sharing stories of their journeys. Artisans worked on items for trade, such as decorated pottery or woven rugs that combined patterns from multiple traditions. The sound of camel bells marked the arrival and departure of caravans, becoming a familiar part of daily life. The Han government benefited from the trade through taxes and the acquisition of luxury items for the imperial court. Silk remained a key export, but other products like lacquered boxes and bronze mirrors gained popularity abroad. In exchange, the court received exotic animals, including lions and ostriches that arrived after long journeys through multiple hands. These items were displayed in imperial parks as symbols of the empire's reach. Political changes within China affected the Western connections. When the Han faced succession disputes and rebellions in the 1st century CE, control over the distant garrisons weakened. Some outposts were abandoned temporarily, allowing local rulers to regain more independence. Yet the trade routes did not disappear. Merchants continued to operate under the protection of whichever authority held the passes at the time. The Kushan Empire rose in the west during this same period, controlling areas from Bactria to northern India. Kushan rulers promoted trade and patronized Buddhism, which helped spread the religion along the Silk Road. Buddhist monasteries built near trade stops, offered shelter to travelers, and served as centers for copying texts and creating art. Sculptures from this time show a blend of Indian, Greek, and local styles, reflecting the cultural flows. Merchants from the Kushan territories brought cotton textiles, ivory, and spices that had come from further south. They also carried ideas about medicine and astronomy that interested Chinese scholars. Some of these concepts were adapted into existing practices, while others remained as curiosities recorded in official histories. The oasis kingdoms maintained their role as intermediaries. Rulers collected tolls and provided guides, ensuring that caravans could pass safely. In return, they gained access to a wider range of goods for their own use and for resale. Small libraries in some towns held records of past transactions and maps of the routes, updated by returning travellers. Environmental factors continued to shape the network. Droughts in certain years reduced water availability, forcing caravans to take longer detours. Sand dunes shifted, sometimes burying old paths and requiring new ones to be marked with stone cairns. Travellers developed practical solutions, such as carrying extra water skins and travelling at night during the hottest months to conserve energy. By the middle of the 1st century CE, the Silk Road had become an established corridor for exchange. The Han expansion had laid the groundwork, but the oasis kingdoms and Western empires kept the system functioning through their own efforts. Goods, technologies, and beliefs moved steadily, connecting people who never met directly but whose lives were linked through these long chains of trade. The human experiences along the route involved constant adaptation. A merchant from Changan might learn basic phrases in a local dialect to negotiate better prices. A guide from the Tarim Basin could recognize the signs of an approaching storm and find shelter for the group. These skills passed from one generation to the next, building a body of practical knowledge that supported the growing traffic. The period marked a shift from tentative contacts to more regular interactions. While large-scale movements of armies were rare after the initial Han campaigns, the daily flow of caravans created a quiet form of integration across vast distances. The routes served as arteries that carried the lifeblood of commerce and connection between the major civilizations of the time, Parthian gatekeepers and Kushan patronage. The stability that had taken hold in the central stretches of the route soon extended its influence westward, where the Parthian Empire served as the primary gatekeeper for goods heading toward the Mediterranean. Parthian rulers, operating from their capital at Ctesiphon along the Tigris River, collected fees on caravans passing through their territories and carefully managed contacts with both Eastern suppliers and Western buyers. This arrangement allowed them to profit substantially from the resale of Chinese silk and other luxuries, which they sold at marked-up prices to Roman merchants who gathered in cities like Antioch and Palmyra. Roman authors of the time noted the high cost of these imports, with some complaining that the empire's gold was flowing eastward in exchange for items that offered little practical value beyond status and display. Parthian administrators maintained detailed records of the traffic moving. Through key hubs such as Merv and Ecbatana, where one branch of the route turned north toward the steppes and another continued into Bactria, they issued safe conduct documents to trusted merchant groups and stationed guards at mountain passes to deter raids from local tribes. In return for this protection, caravans paid a percentage of their cargo value, often in the form of coins or goods that could be resold locally. The Parthians also encouraged the use of Bactrian camels, which were better suited to the rugged terrain of their eastern provinces than the single-humped variety common further west. These animals could carry loads of up to 300 pounds each and required less frequent watering, making longer legs of the journey more feasible. In 97 CE, the Han general Ban Chao dispatched his envoy Gan Ying on a mission to establish direct links with the distant power known in Chinese records as Da Qin. Gan Ying travelled through the Tarim Basin and into Parthian lands, reaching the shores of the Persian Gulf. There, local sailors warned him that the sea voyage to the Roman territories would take 2 years and involve dangerous storms and unknown currents. Historians later concluded that these stories were likely exaggerated by Parthian officials eager to preserve their role as indispensable intermediaries. Gan Ying returned without achieving a direct meeting, but his report provided the Chinese court with the first detailed if second-hand description of Roman customs, government, and products. It mentioned their use of glassware, fine wines, and a system of coinage where 10 silver pieces equaled 1 gold unit. Meanwhile, the Kushan Empire reached its height under King Kanishka, whose reign began around 127 CE and lasted for more than 2 decades. Based in the city of Peshawar in what is now northern Pakistan, Kanishka expanded control over territories that included Bactria and parts of northern India, creating a unified zone that linked the central Silk Road segments with Indian Ocean ports. His government issued gold coins modelled on Roman standards, which circulated widely and helped standardize exchange rates for merchants travelling between regions. These coins often featured images of the king himself alongside deities from multiple traditions, reflecting a policy of religious tolerance that supported the empire's diverse population. Kanishka became a major patron of Buddhism, sponsoring the construction of monasteries and stupas at strategic points along the trade corridors. At sites like Taxila and Bigram, large complexes offered lodging for travelling monks and merchants alike, complete with storage facilities for goods and scriptoria where texts were copied. He convened a Buddhist council that helped standardize doctrines and encouraged the translation of scriptures into local languages, including Sanskrit versions that made the teachings more accessible to scholars from different backgrounds. Monks from Kushan territories, such as Lokaksema, later carried these texts eastward to China, where they began the process of adapting Buddhist ideas to local audiences. The artistic style that emerged in Gandhara during this period showed clear influences from multiple sources. Sculptors working in the region produced Buddha figures with realistic facial features, draped robes resembling Greek and Roman togas, and serene expressions drawn from Indian traditions. These statues, carved from schist or stucco, were placed in monasteries and along caravan routes as objects of devotion and markers of safe stopping points. Merchants often commissioned smaller versions to carry with them for personal protection during journeys. The blending of styles created a distinctive visual language that spread with the religion itself, appearing in cave temples further east and influencing later Chinese Buddhist art. Trade under Kushan oversight included a wide range of items beyond silk. Indian cotton textiles, ivory carvings, and spices such as pepper and cinnamon moved westward through Parthian markets and into Roman hands. In exchange, Roman glass beads, coral, and wine amphorae travelled eastward, while Chinese lacquerware and iron implements continued to flow through the system. Kushan ports on the western coast of India served as outlets for maritime extensions of the overland routes, where goods could be loaded onto ships bound for Roman Egypt during the monsoon seasons. This combination of land and sea paths increased the overall volume of exchange and reduced reliance on any single corridor. Key oasis cities under Kushan influence, such as Begram, became thriving centres where warehouses held treasures from across the known world. Archaeological finds from these sites include Roman-style bronze vessels, Chinese mirrors, and Indian ivories stored together, indicating the cosmopolitan nature of daily commerce. Local artisans produced hybrid goods that combined techniques from different regions, such as fused glassware that incorporated Chinese colour methods with Parthian shapes. Markets operated on a schedule tied to caravan arrivals, with auctions for high-value items and fixed stalls for everyday supplies like dried fruits, leather harnesses, and medicinal herbs. The relative peace among the 4 major powers of the era, the Han in the east, the Kushans in the centre, the Parthians in the west, and the Romans beyond, created what some later historians called a period of balanced stability. None of these empires sought to conquer the others outright during the 2nd century CE, allowing resources to focus on internal development and trade facilitation. Parthian and Kushan rulers exchanged embassies and gifts, while Roman coins have been discovered in Kushan hoards, showing the depth of economic ties. This interconnected system meant that a disruption in one area, such as a border skirmish between Parthia and Rome, could ripple through to affect prices in distant Chinese markets. Caravans in this period often included not only merchants, but also religious figures and artisans seeking new patrons. A typical group might number several hundred people and animals, moving in stages to allow rest at fortified way stations equipped with wells and basic fortifications. Guides familiar with the Pamir passes helped navigate the high altitudes, where thin air and sudden weather changes posed constant risks. Travellers carried small pouches of salt or spices as emergency currency and relied on local knowledge for identifying edible plants along the way. At night, campfires served as gathering spots where stories of successful deals or narrow escapes were shared, building a collective body of practical wisdom passed among generations of traders. Kushan support for Buddhism extended beyond construction projects to include the protection of pilgrimage routes. Devotees from as far as China made the journey to sacred sites in India, stopping at Kushan monasteries for instruction and supplies. This movement helped establish permanent communities of monks in oasis towns, where they taught literacy and basic medical care to local residents. Some monasteries maintained libraries of palm leaf manuscripts and wooden tablets, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political upheaval. By the late 2nd century CE, the Kushan realm began to face pressures from internal succession disputes and external threats from neighbouring groups. Yet the trade infrastructure they had strengthened continued to function, with Parthian officials stepping in to fill gaps where Kushan authority weakened. Roman demand for Eastern luxuries remained steady, driving innovations in packaging and transport methods. Silk bales were now wrapped in oiled cloths to protect against moisture, while spices were sealed in ceramic jars to retain their potency over long distances. The human dimension of these exchanges involved individuals adapting to the rhythms of long-distance movement. A Kushan merchant might specialize in sourcing Indian gems for resale in Parthian markets, while a Parthian guide earned extra income by teaching basic phrases in multiple languages to new arrivals. Families in border towns often intermarried across ethnic lines, creating networks of relatives who could provide lodging and introductions in distant cities. Children born along the routes learned multiple dialects from an early age and developed skills in animal care and bargaining that prepared them for careers in trade. Environmental challenges continued to shape operations. In drier years, caravans detoured through river valleys where irrigation systems supported small farms selling fresh produce to travellers. Mountain passes required careful timing to avoid snow blockages, and desert stretches demanded pre-arranged caches of water and fodder maintained by local herders under Kushan or Parthian contracts. These practical arrangements ensured that the flow of goods rarely halted for long, even as political borders shifted slightly over time. As the 2nd century drew toward its close, the cumulative effect of these interactions had created a more integrated economic and cultural landscape. Goods from one end of the continent appeared regularly in markets at the other, while religious ideas and artistic motifs crossed borders with increasing ease. The Parthian gatekeepers and Kushan patrons had each played their part in sustaining the system, setting patterns that would persist even as new powers emerged in the centuries ahead. The routes had evolved from tentative paths into a resilient network capable of withstanding temporary disruptions while continuing to link distant societies through steady, everyday commerce, Sassanian, ascendancy, and Buddhist flourishing. The balance among the major powers began to shift noticeably as the 3rd century opened. The Parthian rulers had grown weary from repeated conflicts with Roman forces along their western borders and from challenges within their own noble families. In 224 CE, a local prince named Ardashir, from the region of Fars in southern Iran, defeated the last Parthian king in battle and declared the start of a new dynasty. He and his successors quickly consolidated control over the territories that had formed the Parthian heartland, extending their authority eastward to the borders of the old Kushan lands. The Sassanian kings established their capital at Ctesiphon and set about reorganizing the administration of trade routes to generate steady revenue for their expanding military needs. They introduced a more centralized system of taxation on caravans, requiring merchants to register at official checkpoints and pay duties based on the declared value of their loads. In exchange, the Sassanians provided stronger protection through a network of fortified stations manned by regular troops rather than local levies. This change reduced the frequency of raids by groups operating from the nearby steppes and allowed merchants to plan their journeys with greater confidence. Ardashir's son Shapur I, who ruled from 240 to 270 CE, further expanded the empire's reach and even captured a Roman emperor during one of their wars, but he also maintained the flow of eastern goods into western markets. Sassanian silver plates and finely woven textiles began appearing in greater numbers along the routes, often featuring intricate designs that blended Persian motifs with elements borrowed from earlier Hellenistic styles. In the eastern regions, the Han dynasty had ended in 220 CE, amid court intrigues and peasant uprisings. The territory split into three rival kingdoms known as Wei, Shu, and Wu, each vying for supremacy. The northern kingdom of Wei, which controlled the approaches to the Silk Road corridors, recognized the importance of keeping those paths open. Its officials encouraged local governors in the northwest to maintain garrisons and way stations, even as central authority fluctuated. When the Western Jin dynasty briefly reunited much of China in 280 CE, it too prioritized the western connections to secure horses and other resources needed for defense against emerging threats from the steppes. The political fragmentation that followed the Jin collapse in the early 4th century created a patchwork of small states in northern China, often called the 16 Kingdoms. Many of these short-lived regimes, particularly those established by rulers of mixed Chinese and nomadic backgrounds, relied heavily on income from trade passing through their territories. The former Liang and later Liang states, centered around the Gansu corridor, actively repaired irrigation systems and built new hostels to attract caravans. Their leaders granted tax exemptions to merchants who agreed to settle and contribute skills or goods locally, which helped stabilize the local economies during times of uncertainty. Amid these changes, a new group of traders from the region around Samarkand and Bukhara gained prominence. Known as the Sogdians, these people spoke an Iranian language and had long inhabited fertile river valleys in what is today Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. They formed tight-knit family networks that operated like extended trading houses, with relatives stationed at key points from the Tarim Basin to the Sassanian borders. Sogdian merchants developed their own written contracts and letters in a distinctive script, many examples of which have survived in desert ruins. These documents record deals involving silk, spices, and even slaves, showing how individual families coordinated shipments across hundreds of miles. Some Sogdian communities established permanent settlements in oasis towns, where they built their own temples and maintained warehouses stocked with goods from multiple regions. The Sogdians specialized in carrying lighter, high-value items that could yield quick profits, such as pearls from the Indian Ocean, medicinal herbs, and small batches of Chinese paper that had begun to replace heavier bamboo or wooden records in some areas. Their presence added a layer of reliability to the system because they often acted as neutral brokers between Chinese suppliers and Western buyers. Families passed down route knowledge through generations, including details about which mountain passes were safest in certain seasons and which local officials could be trusted for fair dealings. Religious activity along the routes intensified during this period of political flux. Buddhism, which had gained a foothold earlier under Kushan patronage, now spread more widely into China as people sought comfort amid the instability of frequent regime changes. Monasteries sprang up in the northern kingdoms, often funded by merchants who donated a portion of their earnings in hopes of ensuring safe journeys. Monks from Central Asian cities like Kucha travelled eastward, bringing Sanskrit texts that they translated into Chinese with the help of local scholars. These translations introduced concepts such as karma and meditation practices that resonated with Chinese ideas of balance and self-cultivation. Some rulers of the northern states sponsored large translation projects, gathering teams of monks in specially built halls where work continued day and night. One notable figure from this time was a monk named Fotudeng, who arrived in northern China around 310 CE from the western regions. He advised several of the 16 kingdoms' rulers on both spiritual and practical matters, using his knowledge of distant lands to recommend diplomatic contacts that could secure trade agreements. His influence helped embed Buddhist institutions more deeply into the administrative fabric of these states, with monasteries sometimes serving as neutral ground for resolving disputes between merchants of different origins. Another faith that began to travel the routes during the mid-3rd century was Manichaeism, founded by a prophet named Mani in the Sassanian territories. Mani himself undertook journeys eastward, reaching parts of Central Asia and possibly India, where he shared his teachings about light and darkness as cosmic forces. His followers, known as the elect and the hearers, established small communities at trading stops. They emphasized a simple lifestyle and vegetarian diet, which appealed to some merchants seeking moral guidance during long absences from home. Manichaean texts, written in multiple languages including Sogdian and Chinese, described a universal religion that incorporated elements from Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism, making it adaptable to the diverse audiences along the Silk Road. Zoroastrianism, the traditional faith of the Sassanian rulers, also maintained a presence. Fire temples were constructed at some key caravan halts under Sassanian control, where priests tended eternal flames and offered blessings for safe passage. The Sassanians promoted their religion as a unifying force within their empire, but generally allowed other beliefs to coexist as long as they did not challenge royal authority. This tolerance facilitated the continued movement of people and ideas, preventing religious conflicts from disrupting the flow of goods. Trade volumes experienced temporary dips when major wars broke out between the Sassanians and the Roman or later Byzantine empires, but the system proved resilient. Merchants rerouted shipments through alternative passes or waited out conflicts in secure oasis towns. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Tarim Basin shows that even during these periods, items such as Sassanian coins and glass vessels continued to reach Chinese markets, often through Sogdian intermediaries who maintained contacts on both sides. The goods exchange now included more practical items like iron tools from Sassanian forges and high-quality paper produced in Chinese workshops using techniques refined over generations. Life in the oasis settlements reflected the growing diversity. Markets featured stalls run by Sogdian traders, offering dates from Western orchards alongside Chinese lacquer boxes. Local artisans learned to produce hybrid styles, such as pottery decorated with Persian floral patterns, but fired using Chinese kiln methods. Children in these communities grew up hearing stories in several languages, and often learned basic accounting from their parents' business records. Women in merchant families sometimes managed accounts while husbands were away, a role that gave them influence in local economic decisions. Diplomatic efforts also helped sustain connections. Envoys from northern Chinese states occasionally travelled westward to the Sassanian court, carrying gifts of silk and receiving in return exotic animals or technical knowledge about metalworking. These missions, though infrequent, reinforced the idea that cooperation across distances benefited everyone involved. The Sassanian kings, for their part, sent missions eastward to gather intelligence about potential allies against nomadic threats on their northern frontiers. By the middle of the 4th century, the Buddhist presence in China had become substantial enough that large cave complexes, such as those expanded near Dunhuang, housed hundreds of monks and served as libraries and rest stops for travellers. Pilgrims began making longer journeys to India in search of original texts and sacred sites, following the same routes used by merchants but carrying scriptures instead of commercial cargo. Their accounts, recorded later, described the practical challenges of high mountain crossings and the hospitality offered at monasteries along the way. The Sogdian networks expanded during this era, with some families establishing outposts as far east as the Chinese capital regions and as far west as the Black Sea fringes. Their letters, discovered in later excavations, reveal a sophisticated system of credit and partnership agreements that allowed trade to continue even when individual caravans faced delays. This commercial infrastructure complemented the religious networks, creating overlapping webs of support that helped individuals navigate the uncertainties of the time. Environmental conditions still influenced decisions. Periods of drier weather in the 4th century forced some groups to rely more on river-based segments of the route, where boats could supplement camel transport. Communities along those stretches developed ferry services and maintained docks stocked with replacement harnesses and fodder. The Sassanians invested in improving water channels in their eastern provinces to support larger settlements that could service increased traffic. The overall pattern showed how political changes at the imperial level created opportunities for local actors like the Sogdians to step forward and fill gaps. Buddhism provided a shared cultural framework that eased interactions among people from different backgrounds, while the Sassanian administration supplied the security needed for long-distance movement. Trade and cultural exchange continued to reinforce each other, with merchants acting as unwitting carriers of ideas and monks occasionally negotiating deals on the side to fund their religious activities. As the 4th century progressed, these adaptations laid the groundwork for even more extensive connections in the centuries ahead. The empires and kingdoms along the routes had learned that maintaining open paths served their interests better than isolation, even amid frequent shifts in power. The human stories of families building lives around the trade, of monks preserving texts through turbulent times, and of rulers balancing revenue with tolerance formed the quiet backbone of this enduring network. Tang Golden Age, and the peak of caravan traffic. The political landscape in China stabilized dramatically when the Sui dynasty reunified the country in 589 CE after centuries of division. But it was the Tang dynasty, founded in 618 CE by Li Yuan and his son Li Shimin, who ruled as Emperor Taizong, that brought the Silk Road to its greatest height of activity. The Tang capital at Changan became the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world at the time, with over 1 million residents living within its carefully planned grid of streets. Foreign merchants from Sogdian, Persian, Turkic, and Indian backgrounds maintained permanent quarters in the Western markets, where they stored goods and conducted business under Tang regulations. The government issued official licenses to traders and maintained warehouses that held imported items until duties were paid. Emperor Taizong pursued an active Western policy, sending military expeditions that secured the Tarim Basin and established protectorates over key oasis states. In 640 CE, Tang forces captured the important city of Gaochang, which had served as a hub for Sogdian traders. Rather than destroy the local administration, the Tang incorporated it into their system, appointing a Chinese governor while allowing local customs to continue. This approach encouraged merchants to route more caravans through Tang-controlled territory, knowing they would receive fair treatment and protection from bandit groups. By the mid-7th century, Tang armies had pushed as far as the Pamir Mountains, creating a corridor of relative security that stretched from Changan deep into Central Asia. The volume of trade surged under these conditions. Records from the period indicate that thousands of camels entered and left Changan each year, carrying loads that included bales of raw and finished silk, porcelain vessels with delicate glazes, and tea that was becoming popular among Central Asian elites. In return, merchants brought horses from the Fergana region, which the Tang military prized for their speed and endurance. Other imports included frankincense and myrrh for use in Buddhist rituals, pearls and coral from Indian waters, and fine woolen textiles from Persian workshops. The Tang court itself consumed large quantities of these luxuries, using them to reward officials and entertain foreign envoys who arrived with tribute missions. Tang emperors maintained a policy of openness toward foreign ideas and peoples. Changan hosted communities of Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians, and Manichaeans alongside the growing number of Buddhist temples and Taoist shrines. A famous Nestorian stele, erected in 781 CE, records how a monk named Alopen arrived from the west in 635 CE and received permission from Emperor Taizong to translate scriptures and build a church. Similar tolerance extended to merchants, who could practice their own religions in designated areas without interference. This atmosphere made the city a magnet for travellers seeking both profit and new experiences. Sogdian traders continued to dominate much of the overland commerce, but now they operated under Tang oversight. Many Sogdians settled permanently in Chinese cities, adopting Chinese surnames while maintaining their family trading networks. Their women sometimes ran businesses in their husband's absence, and their children attended schools where they learned both Sogdian and Chinese writing. Archaeological finds from Turfan show Sogdian language contracts mixed with Chinese administrative documents, illustrating the daily blending of cultures in frontier towns. The Tang government improved the infrastructure supporting the routes. They repaired and expanded the Great Wall sections in the northwest, and built new beacon towers that used smoke signals by day and fire signals by night to relay messages across long distances. Postal stations along the main roads provided fresh horses for official couriers and basic lodging for merchants. These stations also served as markets where small transactions could take place without the need to travel all the way to major cities. Irrigation projects in the Hexi corridor increased agricultural output, ensuring that caravans could purchase reliable supplies of grain and fodder at reasonable prices. Buddhist pilgrimage reached new levels during the Tang. The most famous traveller was the monk Xuanzang, who left Changan in 629 CE without official permission and spent 16 years journeying to India and back. He crossed the Gobi Desert, climbed the Tian Shan Mountains, and navigated the Hindu Kush before reaching the great Buddhist centres in northern India. Along the way, he studied with local masters and collected hundreds of Sanskrit manuscripts. Upon his return in 645 CE, Emperor Taizong welcomed him and provided support for a massive translation project that produced Chinese versions of key Buddhist texts. Xuanzang's detailed record of his journey, known as the Great Tang Records on the Western regions, described the landscapes, customs, and political conditions he encountered, offering later generations a vivid picture of Central Asia in the 7th century. Other pilgrims followed similar paths, and their movements helped spread not only religious teachings, but also practical knowledge. Monks introduced new varieties of fruit trees and medicinal plants to Chinese gardens. Some brought back techniques for dyeing textiles or refining sugar that found their way into local workshops. Monasteries along the routes expanded their roles as rest stops, with larger kitchens and storage rooms to accommodate the increased number of travellers. The Tang also engaged with the emerging power of the Tibetan Empire, which controlled important passes through the Himalayas and sometimes disrupted or protected segments of the southern routes. Diplomatic marriages, such as the one between a Tang princess and the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo around 641 CE, helped secure peaceful relations and keep trade flowing. Tibetan officials occasionally escorted caravans through their territories in exchange for shares of the goods or access to Chinese technologies like paper and printing methods that were beginning to develop. In the west, the Sassanian Empire fell to the rising Arab forces in the mid-7th century. The Battle of Qadisi year in 636 CE and the subsequent conquest of Ctesiphon marked the end of Sassanian rule. Many Persian nobles and merchants fled eastward, bringing their skills and knowledge into Tang territories. Some settled in Changan and introduced new culinary practices, such as the use of certain spices and cooking methods that influenced Tang cuisine. Others joined existing trading networks, adding Persian glassware and metalwork to the goods moving along the Silk Road. The early Islamic caliphates that replaced the Sassanians initially focused on consolidating their Western holdings, but they soon recognized the value of the Eastern trade. Arab merchants began appearing in Central Asian markets, bringing silver coins and new administrative practices. The Tang court received envoys from the Umayyad and later Abbasid caliphs, exchanging gifts and establishing protocols for safe conduct. This contact introduced Chinese officials to Islamic ideas about law and governance, though direct influence remained limited at first. Caravan traffic reached its peak in the early 8th century under Emperor Xuanzong. Markets in Changan overflowed with goods from every direction. Foreign musicians and dancers performed in the entertainment quarters, while restaurants served dishes adapted from Western recipes. The government minted large quantities of copper coins to facilitate trade, and these coins have been found as far west as the Abbasid territories. The Tang legal code included specific provisions for foreign residents, protecting their property and allowing them to follow their own customs in personal matters while requiring adherence to Chinese law in commercial disputes. The human stories from this era highlight the opportunities available to ordinary people. A young Sogdian man might start as an assistant in his family's warehouse in Turfan, learning to evaluate silk quality and calculate exchange rates. Over time, he could lead his own small caravan westward, returning with profits that allowed him to expand the family business. Women in these families managed inventories and correspondence, often using their knowledge of multiple languages to negotiate better terms with suppliers. Soldiers stationed at frontier garrisons supplemented their pay by offering escort services to merchants, creating personal networks that lasted across generations. Buddhist monasteries accumulated wealth from donations by successful traders, using the funds to commission elaborate wall paintings and statues. The Mogao caves near Dunhuang contain thousands of such artworks dating from the Tang period, depicting scenes of paradise, donors in foreign dress, and processions of caravans. These images served both religious and decorative purposes, reminding travellers of the spiritual rewards of generosity, while also showcasing the diversity of people moving along the routes. Environmental management became more sophisticated. Tang engineers improved canal systems that linked river transport with overland paths, allowing heavier goods to move more efficiently in certain seasons. They also planted trees along key stretches to provide windbreaks and shade, reducing the impact of sandstorms in the desert areas. Weather observation stations shared information about approaching storms, helping caravans time their departures. The peak of Tang prosperity began to face challenges by the middle of the 8th century. The An Lushan Rebellion, which broke out in 755 CE, weakened central control and disrupted the western garrisons. Many foreign communities in Changan suffered during the unrest, and some merchants relocated their operations to more stable southern ports. Yet the core routes did not collapse entirely. Local commanders in the northwest continued to facilitate trade on a reduced scale, and the Sogdian networks proved flexible enough to adapt to the new conditions. Even as Tang power waned after the rebellion, the cultural exchanges set in motion during the Golden Age left lasting marks. New varieties of crops, musical instruments, and clothing styles had been integrated into Chinese life. Buddhist schools that developed during this period, such as Chan, later known as Zen, drew on ideas that had travelled along the Silk Road. The cosmopolitan atmosphere of the Tang capital influenced literature and art for centuries afterward, with poets describing the sights and sounds of foreign quarters in vivid detail. The era demonstrated how a strong, open administration in China, combined with stable conditions in Central Asia, could support an unprecedented level of long-distance exchange. Merchants, monks, and officials each contributed to keeping the routes active, creating a period when the Silk Road truly functioned as a bridge between civilizations on a scale never seen before. The wealth and ideas that flowed during these decades shaped the development of societies at both ends of the network and left a legacy that would influence later periods, even after the Tang dynasty itself had passed into history. Uyghur and Tibetan influence in the fragmented era after. The An Lushan Rebellion weakened the Tang central government. Control over the northwestern corridors passed increasingly into the hands of local powers and nomadic confederations that had long interacted with the settled regions. One group that rose to prominence in the mid-8th century was the Uyghurs, a Turkic-speaking people who established a powerful khaganate centered in the Orkhon Valley of Mongolia. They had assisted the Tang in suppressing the rebellion and received generous rewards in the form of trade privileges and marriage alliances. By 744 CE, the Uyghurs had unified several Turkic tribes and soon extended their influence southward into the Tarim Basin and the Gansu Corridor, where they could directly oversee segments of the Silk Road. The Uyghur rulers maintained friendly relations with the Tang court for several decades, supplying horses in exchange for large quantities of silk that they then resold westward. Their capital at Karabalgasun became a hub where Sogdian merchants mingled with Turkic administrators and Chinese envoys. The Uyghurs adopted elements of Sogdian culture, including the use of a Sogdian-derived script for their own language, which allowed them to keep detailed records of tribute and trade transactions. Many Uyghur nobles converted to Manichaeism, which had spread among the Turkic peoples through Sogdian missionaries. Manichaean temples in Uyghur territory offered lodging to travellers and maintained storehouses for goods, functioning much like the Buddhist monasteries further south. Uyghur control brought a measure of stability to the northern routes during a time when Tang authority had receded. They protected caravans from raids by rival tribes and collected tolls that funded their growing administration. Merchants appreciated the predictability, even if the fees were sometimes higher than under direct Tang rule. Uyghur horsemen escorted large caravans through the steppes, using their knowledge of seasonal pastures to keep animals well fed. In return, they acquired Chinese luxury goods that enhanced the status of their elite families. Some Uyghur leaders even maintained residences in Changan, where they could conduct business directly with Tang officials. Further south, the Tibetan Empire reached the height of its power in the 8th and early 9th centuries under kings such as Trisong Detsen. Tibetan forces expanded westward into the Tarim Basin and eastward into the Hexi Corridor, at times clashing with both Tang and Uyghur interests. They captured key oasis cities like Dunhuang for periods and established garrisons that collected taxes on passing trade. Tibetan administrators proved pragmatic, often allowing existing Sogdian and Chinese merchant communities to continue their activities while imposing their own system of duties. Buddhist monasteries in Tibetan-controlled areas received royal patronage, and the king sponsored the translation of scriptures into Tibetan, creating a distinct Buddhist tradition that incorporated elements from Indian, Chinese, and Central Asian sources. The Tibetan presence opened alternative southern routes that skirted the main Tarim paths and crossed higher passes through the Kunlun and Himalayan ranges. These paths were more difficult but offered access to Indian markets and avoided some of the conflicts affecting the northern corridors. Tibetan merchants specialized in moving lightweight, high-value items such as musk, medicinal herbs, and turquoise, which found ready buyers in both Chinese and Western markets. They also facilitated the exchange of military technology, including improved saddle designs and armor techniques that spread among the nomadic groups. During the late Tang period, the interplay between Uyghur, Tibetan, and residual Tang forces created a complex but functional balance. When the Tang dynasty formally ended in 907 CE, northern China fragmented once more into the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. The short-lived regimes in the north, particularly those based in the Shaanxi and Gansu regions, depended heavily on revenue from whatever trade still passed through their territories. They negotiated agreements with Uyghur and Tibetan authorities to keep the routes operational, often sealing deals with marriages or shared military commands against common threats like bandit gangs. Sogdian trading families adapted to these shifts by strengthening their own networks. Many relocated their main operations to towns like Ganzhou and Dunhuang, where they could deal directly with whichever power held local sway. Their letters from this era, preserved in dry desert conditions, show families coordinating shipments across political boundaries, using trusted agents who spoke multiple languages and understood the different tax systems. Some Sogdian clans intermarried with Uyghur or Tibetan elites, creating hybrid families that combined commercial expertise with political connections. Religious life continued to evolve amid the changes. Manichaeism remained strong among the Uyghurs until the mid-9th century, when internal shifts and external pressures led many to adopt Buddhism instead. Buddhist cave temples in the region expanded, with new chambers added to house-growing collections of texts and images donated by merchants seeking merit for safe journeys. Tibetan Buddhist practices influenced the art styles, introducing more elaborate mandalas and protective deities that appeared in wall paintings alongside older Chinese and Sogdian motifs. Monasteries served as neutral zones where merchants from rival groups could meet safely to arrange deals or resolve disputes. The Uyghur Khaganate faced a major crisis in 840 CE, when another Turkic group, the Kyrgyz, attacked their capital and forced the ruling clan to flee southward. Many Uyghurs resettled in the Turfan Basin and Gansu, where they established smaller kingdoms that continued to facilitate trade. These Western Uyghur states maintained close ties with the emerging Song dynasty in China after 960 CE, and with the Kara Khanid Khanate that arose in Central Asia. They specialized in producing and exporting fine cotton textiles and paper, while importing horses and jade that were highly valued in Chinese markets. Tibetan influence persisted in the southern corridors, even after the Tibetan Empire fragmented in the mid-9th century. Local Tibetan chieftains controlled mountain passes and offered protection services to caravans willing to pay. They also participated in the tea horse trade that linked Chinese tea-producing regions with Tibetan and Central Asian horse breeders. This specialized exchange became an important supplement to the broader Silk Road traffic, providing essential war animals to Chinese armies and a popular beverage that spread westward. Daily life in the oasis towns during this fragmented era reflected the mixture of influences. Markets featured Uyghur vendors selling fermented mare's milk alongside Tibetan traders offering yak butter and wool. Chinese administrators in the remaining Tang outposts, or their successors, collected standardized taxes using copper coins that circulated widely. Artisans produced goods that blended styles, such as ceramics with Tibetan geometric patterns but shaped on Chinese potters' wheels. Children in these communities learned practical skills early, helping with animal care or simple bookkeeping while absorbing stories from travelers of different backgrounds. Environmental pressures tested the resilience of the networks. A series of droughts in the mid-9th century reduced water levels in key rivers, forcing caravans to rely more on wells maintained by local communities. Uyghur and Tibetan groups organized labor to dig deeper wells and repair irrigation channels, ensuring that critical stopping points remained viable. Nomadic herders on the fringes supplied additional camels and horses when settled breeders faced shortages, creating economic links between mobile and fixed populations. Diplomatic contacts continued despite the political divisions. Envoys from the 5 dynasties traveled to Uyghur courts with gifts of silk and received horses and intelligence about conditions further west in return. Similar missions reached Tibetan leaders, helping to prevent major conflicts that could close the routes entirely. These exchanges kept information flowing about market conditions, new products, and potential dangers, allowing merchants to adjust their plans accordingly. By the late 10th century, as the Song dynasty consolidated power in southern and central China, the northern routes operated under a looser arrangement involving Uyghur, Tibetan, and emerging Turkic Khanates. The Song government focused more on maritime trade through southern ports, but still valued the overland connections for obtaining superior horses and certain luxury items. They established horse trading offices in border towns where Uyghur and Tibetan suppliers could sell animals under regulated conditions. The period of fragmentation showed the durability of the Silk Road system. Even without a single dominant empire controlling the entire length, local powers and merchant networks found ways to keep goods and people moving. The Uyghurs and Tibetans each contributed their own strengths: military protection, alternative routes, and specialized commodities that complemented rather than replaced the existing infrastructure. Religious institutions provided continuity and support services that helped bridge gaps during times of political uncertainty. Merchants learned to operate with greater flexibility, maintaining contacts with multiple authorities and diversifying their cargoes to reduce risk. Families built resilience by spreading members across different regions, ensuring that if one segment of the route faced disruption, others could continue the business. The cultural exchanges that had begun centuries earlier continued, with new artistic motifs and religious practices spreading through the same channels that carried silk and spices. This era of multiple influences set the stage for the next major transformation when a new force from the steppes would unify much of the overland network under a single authority. The adaptations made during the Uyghur and Tibetan periods of prominence demonstrated that the routes could survive and even thrive amid changing political landscapes, as long as practical benefits outweighed the costs of insecurity. The human connections forged through trade, marriage, and shared religious spaces created a foundation that later powers would build upon, ensuring that the movement of goods and ideas across Central Asia remained a defining feature of the region for centuries to come. Mongol unification and the Pax Mongolica, the scattered powers that had managed segments of the routes for centuries, faced a decisive change when the Mongol tribes of the eastern steppes began to consolidate under one leader in the early 13th century. Temujin, born into a minor clan around 1162, spent his early years navigating the harsh realities of tribal rivalries, losing his father young and facing betrayal from former allies. Through a series of calculated alliances, raids, and demonstrations of loyalty, he built a following that crossed traditional clan lines. In 1206, at a grand assembly near the Onon River, the gathered chieftains proclaimed him Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, and committed their warriors to his command. This unification transformed the Mongols from a collection of feuding groups into a disciplined military force organized by a decimal system of units, with commanders selected for merit rather than birth. Genghis Khan directed his armies first against neighbouring tribes and then outward in a series of campaigns that reshaped Central Asia. Between 1209 and 1218, Mongol forces subdued the western Uyghur kingdoms and the Karakhanid territories, incorporating their administrative expertise and trading networks into the growing empire. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of Persia and Transoxiana, followed in 1219 after a diplomatic incident involving the execution of Mongol envoys. Mongol armies under Genghis and his generals captured major cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, often offering surrender terms that allowed local populations to continue their work if they accepted Mongol overlordship. Resistance led to harsher measures, but once control was established, the Mongols quickly restored order and reopened markets to resume trade. The Mongol approach to governance emphasized practical control over vast territories. Genghis Khan divided the empire among his sons and appointed trusted officials to oversee conquered lands, many of whom were drawn from Uyghur, Chinese, and Persian backgrounds. They introduced a written legal code known as the Yasa, which standardized rules on everything from military discipline to the protection of merchants. This code, combined with the Mongols' tolerance for local customs and religions, helped stabilize the regions they ruled. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227 during a campaign against the Western Xia, his empire stretched from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea, creating the largest contiguous land empire the world had yet seen. His successors continued the expansion. Ögedei Khan, who ruled from 1229 to 1241, completed the conquest of northern China and pushed further into Europe and the Middle East. The empire was then divided into 4 khanates: the Golden Horde in the west, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, who became Great Khan in 1260. These semi-autonomous realms maintained close ties through a shared postal system called the Yam, which consisted of way stations spaced about every 25 miles along the main routes. Riders on fresh horses could cover up to 200 miles a day carrying official messages, orders, and news of market conditions. Merchants with special paisa tablets, gold or silver plaques, issued by the Khans, received the same protection and supplies, making long-distance travel safer than at any previous time. This period of relative peace and security, often called the Pax Mongolica, lasted roughly from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century. Trade volumes along the Silk Road increased dramatically because caravans could now cross the entire length of the empire without changing political authorities at every border. Goods moved with fewer interruptions, and the Mongols actively encouraged commerce by lowering some taxes and providing escorts for large shipments. Chinese silk, porcelain, and printed books travelled westward in greater quantities, while European and Persian woolens, glassware, and silver coins flowed eastward. The yam stations doubled as markets and rest houses, stocked with grain, fodder, and spare animals maintained by local communities under Mongol oversight. Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, moving the capital to Dadu, the site of modern Beijing, and integrating Chinese administrative practices with Mongol military organization. He sponsored large-scale public works, including the repair and extension of canals that linked the Silk Road's overland paths with river and coastal transport. Under Yuan rule, foreign merchants from as far as Italy and Arabia received privileges in Chinese cities, where they lived in designated quarters and followed their own laws in internal matters. The Yuan government minted paper money backed by silver reserves, which circulated widely and simplified transactions across the empire. This innovation reduced the need for heavy coinage on long journeys and encouraged larger investments in trade ventures. One of the most famous travellers of this era was the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who arrived in the Yuan court around 1275 with his father and uncle. They had journeyed overland through the Ilkhanate and Central Asia, following the well-maintained roads and staying at yam stations along the way. Polo spent 17 years in Kublai Khan's service, travelling to various provinces and carrying out administrative tasks. His later account, dictated while a prisoner in Genoa, described the wealth of Chinese cities, the efficiency of the postal system, the use of coal for fuel, and the production of paper money details that introduced many Europeans to the scale of Asian economies. Although some scholars debate the exact extent of his personal travels, his descriptions align with other contemporary records and helped spark European interest in direct trade with the East. Cultural and technological exchanges accelerated under Mongol rule. Artisans from different regions were relocated to imperial workshops, where they collaborated on new designs. Persian weavers taught Chinese craftsmen advanced carpet-making techniques, while Chinese gunpowder formulas reached the Middle East and Europe through Mongol armies and merchants. Medical knowledge also spread. Persian physicians introduced new herbal remedies at the Yuan court, and Chinese acupuncture practices appeared in Ilkhanate records. Religious communities thrived because the Mongols practiced a form of religious tolerance rooted in their shamanistic traditions. Nestorian Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Taoists all maintained places of worship along the routes, often sharing compounds in larger trading towns. Franciscan friars from Europe, such as John of Montecorvino, established missions in Dadu with official permission, while Buddhist monks from Tibet and India continued their pilgrimages under Mongol protection. Daily operations in the caravan cities reflected this integration. Markets in Samarkand and Kashgar bustled with traders exchanging Central Asian horses for Chinese tea and lacquerware. Local officials issued travel permits that listed destinations and cargo, which were checked at yam stations to prevent smuggling or banditry. Families of Mongol soldiers often settled near these stations, farming small plots to supply the system and learning local languages to facilitate business. Children born in these mixed communities grew up fluent in several tongues and skilled in both herding and accounting. Women in merchant households managed warehouses and negotiated contracts during their husbands' absences, contributing to the economic resilience of the networks. The Mongols invested in infrastructure that supported higher traffic. They repaired old irrigation systems in the oases and dug new wells in desert stretches, using labour from conquered populations supplemented by tax revenues from trade. Bridges over rivers in the mountain passes were rebuilt with stone and timber, allowing heavier loads to move year-round. Weather observation posts along the yam routes shared information about storms and snow blockages, helping caravans adjust schedules. These improvements reduced the time for a full journey from China to the Mediterranean from several years to under a year in favourable conditions. By the early 14th century, the four khanates operated with enough coordination to keep the routes functioning even during occasional succession disputes. The Ilkhanate under rulers like Ghazan Khan converted to Islam and maintained strong commercial ties with the Yuan, exchanging embassies that carried technical books and skilled workers. The Chagatai Khanate, centered in Central Asia, focused on protecting the core Silk Road corridors and collecting moderate tolls that funded local security. The Golden Horde in the west facilitated trade with European merchants at Black Sea ports, where Italian city-states like Genoa and Venice established trading colonies. The human dimension of this era involved people adapting to a world where distance no longer meant isolation. A Sogdian-descended merchant family might have branches in Dadu, Tabriz and Sarai, coordinating shipments via yam messengers and sharing profits through family councils. Travellers carried letters of credit issued by Mongol banks, which could be redeemed at distant outposts without transporting large amounts of currency. Artisans produced hybrid goods, such as porcelain bowls painted with Persian motifs or metalwork, combining Chinese dragon designs with Islamic calligraphy. These items found buyers across the empire and beyond, stimulating further innovation. Environmental factors were managed more systematically than before. The Mongols enforced grazing regulations to prevent overgrazing near trade routes and organised communal efforts to clear sand from paths after storms. In drier periods, they rerouted caravans through better watered valleys and maintained emergency fodder depots. Such planning helped sustain the increased volume of traffic without exhausting local resources. The Pax Mongolica reached its height around the reign of Kublai Khan's successors in the late 13th and early 14th. Centuries. Trade brought prosperity to cities that had suffered during earlier conquests, with populations recovering and markets expanding. The empire's size allowed for the movement of entire communities of specialists, such as weavers or astronomers, who introduced new techniques wherever they settled. European visitors noted the safety of the roads, where a traveller could journey from one end to the other with only a single passport and minimal armed escort. Yet the system also carried unintended consequences. The movement of people and goods facilitated the spread of diseases, including the plague that originated in Central Asia and reached Europe in the mid-14th century. This pandemic disrupted trade temporarily, but the underlying infrastructure survived and recovered once the immediate crisis passed. The Mongols' administrative records from this time, written in multiple scripts on paper, document the scale of commerce, listing thousands of camels and horses moving annually through key checkpoints. As the 14th century progressed, the unity among the khanates began to fray due to internal rivalries and external pressures from emerging powers. The Yuan dynasty faced rebellions in China, while the Ilkhanate fragmented after the death of its last major ruler in 1335. The Chagatai Khanate split into eastern and western branches, with the western part later coming under the influence of Timur in the late 14th century. Despite these shifts, the roads and yam stations remained in use, and local rulers continued to profit from whatever traffic they could secure. The Mongol era had demonstrated that a unified administration spanning the continent could elevate the Silk Road to levels of activity and safety unmatched in previous centuries. Merchants, officials, and travellers from diverse backgrounds had interacted on a scale that left lasting changes in technology, cuisine, and knowledge. Crops like sorghum and new strains of cotton spread more widely, while artistic styles blended in ways that influenced later Islamic and Chinese traditions. The legacy of this period lay in the practical networks. It strengthened networks that would outlast the empire itself and continue to connect distant societies even as new powers rose to prominence. Timurid, revival, and the shifting trade balance. The unity imposed by the Mongol Khanates had begun to crack by the mid-14th century, as succession struggles and regional revolts weakened the central coordination that had made the yam system so effective. In the western parts of the former Chagatai Khanate, a local leader named Timur rose to power through a combination of military skill and strategic marriages. Born around 1336 near Samarkand into a family claiming descent from Mongol nobility, Timur spent his youth fighting in tribal conflicts and gradually assembled a loyal force of Turkic and Mongol warriors. By 1370, he had seized control of Transoxiana and declared himself emir, establishing a new base in Samarkand that would serve as the heart of his expanding domain. Unlike the earlier Mongol rulers who often destroyed cities they captured, Timur rebuilt and beautified the ones he took, turning Samarkand into a centre of learning and commerce that drew artisans and scholars from across the conquered lands. Timur's campaigns between 1370 and 1405 extended his authority over Persia, parts of the Middle East, and into northern India. His armies moved with speed and discipline, using the existing road networks to strike quickly and then secure key trading cities like Herat and Bukhara. Once a region was under control, Timur appointed governors who collected moderate taxes on caravans and maintained the way stations that had survived from Mongol times. He encouraged merchants to return by offering protection and lower duties than during the chaotic years of fragmentation. Persian administrators and Sogdian trading families who had worked under the Ilkhanate found new opportunities under Timurid rule, and many resumed long-distance shipments that had slowed during the earlier disruptions. Samarkand became the focal point of Timurid prosperity. The city's markets filled once more with Chinese silk arriving through the eastern passes, Indian spices coming from the south, and European woolens brought by Italian agents who had re-established contacts at Black Sea ports. Timur sponsored the construction of grand mosques, madrasas, and caravanserais, built with blue tiles and intricate geometric patterns that blended Persian, Turkic, and local styles. Artisans relocated from Damascus and Baghdad taught new techniques for glazing pottery and weaving carpets, while astronomers and mathematicians from different regions gathered at the court to refine instruments for navigation and timekeeping. These developments supported trade by improving the accuracy of route planning and the quality of goods available for exchange. After Timur's death in 1405, during a planned campaign against China, his empire divided among his descendants, but the western Timurid states centered on Samarkand and Herat continued to foster commerce. His grandson, Ulugh Beg, ruled from 1447 to 1449 and focused on intellectual pursuits, building an observatory in Samarkand that produced star catalogues used by travellers to determine latitude during desert crossings. Under Timurid governance, the central Silk Road segments regained much of their former volume, with caravans moving spices, textiles, and paper between the Middle East and China. Local rulers in the eastern Chagatai territories maintained separate khanates, but cooperated enough to keep the passes open for mutual benefit. In China, the Ming dynasty had overthrown the Yuan in 1368 under Zhu Yuanzhang, who took the reign name Hongwu. The new emperors viewed the Mongols as foreign occupiers and adopted a more inward-looking policy aimed at restoring traditional Chinese institutions. They rebuilt the Great Wall sections in the north and strengthened frontier defences, but they did not abandon the western connections entirely. Ming officials in the northwest maintained contact with Timurid envoys and continued to receive horses and jade through regulated border markets. The early Ming emperors sent occasional missions westward to gather information about political conditions and to secure alliances against any renewed Mongol threats from the steppes. These missions brought back reports on Timurid stability and helped keep limited trade flowing, though on a smaller scale than under the Yuan. The Ming government encouraged private merchants to operate in the border regions, while keeping tighter control on official tribute missions. Cities like Suzhou and Xi'an served as collection points for silk and porcelain destined for Western markets, but the emphasis shifted towards southern coastal ports, where maritime trade with Southeast Asia and beyond grew rapidly. This gradual pivot reflected practical calculations. Sea voyages could carry larger cargoes with fewer risks from nomadic raids, and new ship designs allowed for regular schedules tied to monsoon winds. Nevertheless, Overland routes through the Gansu corridor remained active for specialized items that benefited from shorter transit times or direct access to Central Asian buyers. In the western reaches of the former Mongol territories, the Ottoman Turks rose to prominence after capturing Constantinople in 1453, renaming it Istanbul and controlling the key land bridge between Europe and Asia. Ottoman sultans collected duties on goods moving through the Bosphorus and along the Anatolian routes that linked to the Silk Road's western ends. They maintained good relations with Timurid successors and later with the Safavid dynasty that emerged in Persia around 1501 under Shah Ismail. The Safavids established their capital at Tabriz and then Isfahan, where they promoted Shia Islam but allowed Christian and Jewish merchant communities to continue operating under protected status. Both the Ottomans and Safavids invested in road repairs and caravanserais, recognizing that steady trade revenue helped fund their military and administrative needs. The interplay among these new powers created a more fragmented but still functional network. Caravans now often changed hands at political boundaries, with Timurid or Safavid agents handling the central segments, Ottoman officials overseeing the final legs into Europe, and Ming border commanders regulating entry from the east. Merchants adapted by forming larger syndicates that pooled resources for insurance against losses and shared information about changing toll rates or political tensions. European traders from Venice and Genoa maintained warehouses in Ottoman ports, buying eastern luxuries that had travelled overland before being shipped across the Mediterranean. Religious and cultural exchanges continued amid these shifts. Timurid courts patronised Persian poetry and miniature painting that depicted caravan scenes with detailed accuracy, showing camel trains winding through mountain passes or merchants bargaining in shaded courtyards. These artworks circulated as gifts among rulers and inspired similar styles in Ming workshops. Safavid Iran became a centre for carpet production, using techniques refined under Timur, with patterns that incorporated motifs from Chinese porcelain arriving via the routes. Buddhist and Islamic communities in the oasis towns maintained their separate spaces, but cooperated on practical matters such as shared water systems and market security. Daily life in trading hubs reflected the adjusted rhythms. In Samarkand, the arrival of a large caravan from the east would trigger several days of intense activity as goods were inspected, taxes paid, and new contracts signed for the next leg westward. Local families supplied fresh bread, dried fruits and fodder, while offering lodging in family-run hostels. Young apprentices learned to evaluate silk quality by touch and to calculate exchange rates using the different coin systems of the Timurids, Safavids, and Ottomans. Women in merchant households often oversaw the storage of valuable items and maintained correspondence with partners in distant cities, using improved postal services that had survived from Mongol times. Environmental adaptations helped sustain operations during this transitional period. Timurid engineers restored ancient Qanat systems underground channels that brought mountain water to desert oases, allowing larger settlements to support increased traffic. Ming officials in the northwest planted shelter belts of trees along key stretches to reduce sand encroachment and provided way stations with emergency water reserves. In the western regions, Ottoman and Safavid administrations organised annual maintenance crews to clear passes before the winter snows and to repair bridges damaged by spring floods. These efforts ensured that even as volumes fluctuated, the core infrastructure did not collapse. By the late 15th century, however, signs of a broader shift became evident. Portuguese navigators had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and reached India by 1498, establishing direct sea links that bypassed the overland intermediaries. Spanish and later Dutch and English ships followed, loading spices and textiles at Indian and Southeast Asian ports for transport back to Europe. These maritime routes offered lower overall costs for bulk goods and reduced exposure to the political uncertainties that still affected some Central Asian segments. Chinese merchants in southern ports increasingly participated in this growing sea trade, exporting porcelain and silk directly to new markets in the Philippines and beyond. The Ming government responded by tightening regulations on private overseas voyages while still permitting controlled tribute missions. Emperor Yongle had earlier sponsored the massive maritime expeditions of Zheng He between 1405 and 1433, which reached as far as the east coast of Africa and brought back exotic goods and knowledge of distant lands. These voyages demonstrated the potential of sea power, but after Yongle's death the court shifted focus back to northern defences and internal consolidation. Overland trade persisted for items like fine horses, jade, and certain medicinal herbs that travelled better by camel than by ship, but the overall proportion of goods moving across Central Asia began a slow decline relative to maritime volumes. Timurid cultural influence outlasted their political unity. The descendants of Timur's line continued to rule smaller principalities in Central Asia and northern India, where the Mughal Empire would later emerge in the 16th century under Babur. Mughal rulers preserved many Timurid administrative practices and artistic traditions while expanding trade contacts with both overland and sea partners. In Persia, the Safavids used their control of the western routes to negotiate favourable terms with Ottoman and European buyers, ensuring that some luxury goods continued to flow through traditional paths even as ships dominated the Indian Ocean. The human experiences of this era involved balancing old routines with new opportunities. A merchant family in Bukhara might divide its operations, with one branch handling overland shipments to Ming border markets, and another investing in joint ventures with Portuguese agents at Indian coastal factories. Guides who had learned the mountain passes from their fathers now supplemented their income by working as interpreters for European travellers seeking overland shortcuts or information about inland markets. Monasteries and madrasas along the routes expanded their roles as information centres, where travellers could consult maps updated with reports from recent journeys and learn basic phrases in the languages of the new powers. Political marriages and diplomatic gifts helped maintain connections across the dividing lines. Ming emperors sent silk robes and porcelain to Timurid and later Mughal courts, receiving horses and rare animals in return. Ottoman sultans exchanged embassies with Safavid shahs to coordinate on caravan security and to manage the flow of goods into European markets. These interactions prevented complete isolation and kept the overland network viable for those willing to accept higher risks for potentially higher profits on specialty items. As the 16th century opened, the Silk Road had entered a phase of transformation rather than disappearance. The Timurid revival had restored much of the Central Corridor's vitality, while the Ming and the rising Islamic empires in the West provided stable endpoints that supported continued activity. Yet the growing efficiency of sea routes introduced a competitive pressure that would reshape global commerce over the following centuries. Merchants who had once relied solely on camel trains began to incorporate sea legs into their strategies, using overland segments only for the parts of the journey where they offered clear advantages. The cultural atmosphere of the time reflected this blending of old and new. Markets in Herat and Isfahan displayed goods from both traditional caravan sources and the new maritime arrivals, such as American silver, that reached Europe by ship and then travelled eastward to pay for Asian luxuries. Artisans experimented with hybrid designs that incorporated motifs from distant cultures encountered through expanded contacts. Families along the routes passed down practical knowledge about which passes remained reliable under different rulers and how to negotiate with officials from multiple empires. This transitional period illustrated the adaptability of the network. Even as maritime alternatives gained prominence, the overland paths retained their role in connecting inland regions that sea routes could not reach directly. The Timurids had shown that strong local leadership could revive commerce after fragmentation, while the Ming focus on controlled borders highlighted the limits of imperial policy in fully replacing established trade habits. The resulting balance set patterns that would define the Silk Road's later history, where overland and maritime systems complemented rather than replaced each other, sustaining exchanges that continued to link distant societies through a combination of tradition and innovation. Safavid height and Qing expansion. The The 16th century had already seen the first Portuguese ships anchoring at Indian ports and loading spices directly, yet the overland corridors through Persia and Central Asia did not vanish. In 1501, a young leader named Ismail unified the Persian tribes and founded the Safavid dynasty, making Shia Islam the state religion and establishing his capital first at Tabriz and later at Isfahan. The Safavids quickly took control of the Western Silk Road terminals that had operated under Timurid governors. They repaired the old caravanserais along the routes from Bukhara to Baghdad and posted soldiers at mountain passes to collect fixed tolls rather than arbitrary levies. Merchants from Europe, India, and China found the new administration predictable. A caravan arriving from the east could unload Chinese porcelain in Isfahan's covered bazaar and load Persian carpets or Armenian silk for the return journey, without negotiating every step with local warlords. Shah Abbas I, who ruled from 1588 to 1629, turned Isfahan into one of the most prosperous cities on the network. He invited Armenian Christian merchants to settle in a special quarter called New Julfa, where they handled much of the export trade to Europe. These families maintained their own churches and schools while cooperating with Muslim traders on joint ventures. The Shah also built a royal road system with way stations every 20 miles, each equipped with fresh horses, water cisterns, and basic medical supplies. Caravans now travelled under royal safe conduct letters that listed the cargo and the owner's name, reducing theft and allowing faster customs clearance. Goods such as raw silk from Gilan province, indigo from India, and coffee from Arabia moved steadily through these routes, even as Portuguese, Dutch, and English ships dominated the Indian Ocean. Further east, the Mughal Empire took shape when Babur, a descendant of Timur, crossed from Central Asia into northern India in 1526 and defeated the Delhi Sultanate. His grandson, Akbar, ruling from 1556 to 1605, expanded the empire across the subcontinent and maintained close contacts with the Safavids through diplomatic marriages and shared trade interests. Mughal officials encouraged merchants to use the overland passes through the Hindu Kush to bring horses from Central Asia and jade from Khotan, items that sea routes could not deliver quickly enough for military needs. Akbar's court at Agra, and later Fatehpur Sikri, became a meeting place for Persian poets, Central Asian horse breeders, and Chinese envoys who arrived with small caravans carrying lacquerware and tea. The Mughals minted gold coins that circulated alongside Safavid silver, creating a stable currency zone that stretched from the Oxus River to the Ganges. In the north, Russian merchants and Cossack adventurers pushed eastward across the Siberian steppes. By the late 16th century, they had reached the Ob and Yenisei rivers and established trading posts that connected with the western end of the Silk Road through the Kazakh steppes. Russian Tsars exchanged embassies with both Safavid and Mughal courts, seeking direct access to Chinese goods without Ottoman intermediaries. Small caravans of furs and walrus ivory travelled south in exchange for silk and spices, adding a new northern branch that bypassed the older southern routes. The Russians built fortified towns like Tobolsk that served as wintering points for merchants who timed their journeys to avoid the worst steppe blizzards. China's Ming dynasty ended in 1644 amid famine and rebel. Armies. A Manchu-led coalition from the northeast seized Beijing and proclaimed the Qing dynasty under the Shunji emperor. The new rulers faced the task of securing their western frontiers, while the maritime trade continued to expand. By the reign of the Kangxi emperor, who ruled from 1661 to 1722, Qing armies had marched into the Tarim Basin and defeated the last independent Mongol Khans in the region. In 1690, they established military colonies in Hami and Turfan, repairing the old oasis towns and reopening the passes through the Tian Shan. Qing officials issued travel permits to merchants and stationed banner troops at key watering points to protect caravans from raids by remaining nomadic groups. The Qing government maintained the overland connections because they supplied horses for the imperial cavalry and jade for court rituals, items not easily replaced by sea imports. They also encouraged settlement in the northwest by offering land grants to Chinese farmers and Muslim traders from Central Asia. Towns like Yarkand and Kashgar grew under Qing administration, with new mosques and markets built alongside Chinese-style watchtowers. Merchants from Bukhara could now travel under Qing protection as far as the Great Wall, where they exchanged Central Asian wool and dried fruits for bolts of silk produced in Jiangnan workshops. The emperor even sponsored a series of maps that combined Chinese grid systems with information gathered from Muslim astronomers, helping caravans plan safer routes. Cultural exchanges in this period took on new forms. Safavid miniature painters depicted European merchants in their works, showing tall hats and ruffled collars alongside traditional Persian robes. Mughal workshops produced carpets woven with Chinese cloud patterns and Persian floral borders, which found buyers in both Isfahan and Istanbul. Jesuit missionaries arrived at the Qing court in Beijing, bringing European clocks and scientific instruments while learning Chinese and Manchu. Some of these priests travelled westward with official caravans, carrying letters that described the overland journey to European readers. In return, they introduced new ideas about astronomy and cartography that Qing scholars adapted for frontier administration. The volume of goods moving overland remained smaller than in Mongol times, yet the network adapted by focusing on high-value, low-bulk items. Fine porcelain destined for Safavid palaces travelled in padded crates on camelback rather than risking breakage on rough seas. Saffron and pistachios from Persia reached Mughal kitchens faster by caravan than by ship around Africa. Russian sable furs arrived in Beijing through the northern steppe route, and were traded for tea that then moved south to India. Each segment of the network specialised in what it could deliver most efficiently, creating a patchwork system that complemented rather than competed with the maritime lanes. Daily routines in the caravan cities reflected this steady adaptation. In Isfahan's bazaar, merchants from Yazd haggled over bales of Chinese silk, while Armenian agents recorded transactions in ledgers written in both Persian and Armenian script. At Agra, Hindu and Muslim traders shared tea from Qing caravans before loading their own carts with indigo and cotton cloth for the journey north. In Kashgar, Qing soldiers patrolled the streets, while local Uyghur families offered lodging to travellers from Bukhara. Children in these towns learned basic phrases in several languages from an early age, and helped their parents weigh spices or count silver coins from different mints. The Qing emperors used the restored routes for more than commerce. They sent survey teams westward to map river systems and mountain passes, information that helped plan future military campaigns and irrigation projects. In 1720, the Kangxi Emperor received a delegation from the Russian Tsar that had travelled overland through the Kazakh steppes. The meeting resulted in a treaty that defined borders and allowed limited trade at designated frontier posts. Similar agreements with the Dzungar Mongols and later the Kazakhs kept the northern corridors open. In Persia, the Safavid dynasty ended in 1722 when Afghan invaders captured Isfahan, but the trade infrastructure survived. The new rulers and later the Afsharid and Zand dynasties continued to collect tolls and maintain the caravanserais because the revenue was essential. Merchants simply adjusted their routes slightly, bypassing troubled areas until order returned. The same pattern held in Mughal India after Aurangzeb's death in 1707. Regional governors in the northwest kept the passes open to maintain their own incomes, even as central authority weakened. Environmental challenges still shaped decisions. Qing engineers restored sections of ancient canals in the Tarim Basin that had silted up during earlier centuries, allowing farmers to grow wheat and cotton that supplied passing caravans. In Persia, Safavid officials organised annual cleaning of Qanat tunnels so that desert oases could support larger caravans during dry years. Russian traders learned to use sleds on the frozen rivers during winter, extending the usable season for northern shipments. These practical measures ensured that the network could handle seasonal variations without major interruptions. By the mid-18th century, the Qing had consolidated control over Xinjiang, renaming it the New Frontier and integrating it more fully into the empire. They encouraged Muslim merchants from Kokand and Bukhara to settle in frontier towns, granting them tax breaks in exchange for a reliable supply of horses and information about conditions further west. The Emperor Qianlong, who succeeded Kangxi's line, sponsored the compilation of detailed gazetteers that recorded the history and products of each oasis, information that helped merchants plan their loads and routes. European interest in the overland paths also persisted. French and British agents occasionally joined official caravans to gather intelligence about Chinese markets or to negotiate direct trade agreements. Their reports described the safety of the Qing-controlled segments and the variety of goods still available, which encouraged some investors to fund small overland expeditions even as their companies focused on sea trade in Canton and Calcutta. The human side of these connections involved families building lives across multiple empires. A merchant born in Isfahan might spend his youth learning Arabic and Persian in a madrasa, then travel to Mughal Lahore to study Indian accounting methods, and finally settle in a Qing border town where he raised children fluent in Turkic dialects. Such individuals carried not only goods but also recipes, stories, and medical knowledge that mixed with local traditions. Women in these families often managed household accounts and hosted travellers, creating informal networks that smoothed negotiations between different cultural groups. Religious institutions continued to provide support. Sufi shrines along the Persian routes offered shelter to Muslim traders, while Buddhist temples in Qing-controlled oases housed monks who copied texts brought by pilgrims from India. Armenian churches in New Julfa and Jesuit chapels in Beijing served smaller communities but welcomed any traveller in need. These shared spaces allowed people of different faiths to exchange practical advice about road conditions and market prices without formal diplomacy. The period marked a time when the Silk Road operated as one thread in a larger web of global exchange. Overland caravans handled items that required speed or direct access to inland markets, while ships carried bulk commodities between coastal ports. The Safavid and Qing administrations each contributed stability at opposite ends of the network, and the Mughals and Russians added important connecting segments. Together they kept the ancient paths functional, even as the centre of world commerce shifted toward the oceans. This adaptation showed the resilience of the routes. Merchants who had once relied solely on camels now sometimes combined overland legs with short sea crossings at the Persian Gulf or Black Sea. Governments invested in roads and maps because the revenue from tolls and the strategic value of secure borders justified the expense. The cultural blending that occurred in the bazaars and caravanserais produced new artistic styles, hybrid cuisines, and shared technical knowledge that enriched societies from Beijing to Istanbul. As the 18th century drew toward its close, the network had settled into a mature form. It no longer dominated global trade, yet it continued to link the interior regions of Asia in ways that sea routes could not duplicate. The Safavid legacy of orderly administration, the Mughal emphasis on cultural patronage, and the Qing system of frontier control each left their mark on how goods and people moved across the continent. These contributions ensured that the Silk Road, though transformed, remained a living corridor of connection rather than a forgotten relic of earlier empires. The Great Game and the fading caravans, the Qing emperors had brought a measure of order to the western frontiers by the late 18th century, but the 19th century introduced pressures that no previous dynasty had faced on such a scale. European powers, driven by the Industrial Revolution and new technologies, began to view Central Asia not just as a corridor for silk and spices, but as a strategic arena for political influence and raw materials. In Russia, Tsar Alexander I and his successors looked eastward across the steppes with an eye toward expanding their empire's borders and securing trade routes that could bypass Ottoman control. Russian merchants and Cossack settlers moved into the Kazakh steppes, establishing fortified outposts that gradually became towns like Orenburg and Semipalatinsk. By the 1820s, Russian forces had begun systematic campaigns against the independent khanates of Kokand, Bukhara, and Khiva, citing the need to protect their traders from raids and to open reliable paths for cotton and other goods. These advances alarmed British officials in India, who feared that a Russian presence too close to the Afghan passes could threaten the security of their Indian possessions. The resulting rivalry, known among diplomats as the Great Game, played out through spies, diplomatic missions, and occasional military expeditions rather than open war between the two empires. British agents travelled disguised as merchants or holy men into the mountain kingdoms of the Hindu Kush, mapping passes and assessing the loyalty of local rulers. Russian officers did the same from the north, offering treaties and military advisors to Khans who felt squeezed between the two powers. The Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva tried to balance these influences by playing one side against the other, granting trade concessions to whichever envoy arrived first with better terms. In China, the Qing government faced its own internal and external challenges. The Opium Wars of the 1840s, sparked by British efforts to force open Chinese ports for the opium trade, weakened imperial finances and distracted attention from the western borders. Rebellions such as the Taiping Uprising in the 1850s and the Dungan Revolt in the northwest during the 1860s further strained resources. Local Muslim leaders in Xinjiang declared short-lived independent states, disrupting caravan traffic for years at a time. Qing armies eventually reasserted control under generals like Zhuo Zongtang, but the campaigns consumed vast sums and left the frontier garrisons underfunded. Merchants who had once relied on Qing protection now hired private escorts or rerouted shipments through more stable Russian-controlled areas. The Industrial Revolution altered the economics of long-distance trade in ways that favoured sea routes over camels. Steamships could cross oceans in weeks rather than months, and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 shortened the journey from Europe to Asia by thousands of miles. Factories in Manchester and Lyon produced cotton textiles more cheaply than hand-woven Central Asian cloths, while railways in India and Russia began to link inland markets to coastal ports. The Trans-Caspian Railway, completed by the Russians in the 1880s, ran from the Caspian Sea through Samarkand to Tashkent, and later connected with lines reaching the Chinese border. Merchants loaded goods onto trains for part of the journey, reducing the need for full camel caravans across the deserts. Cotton from Central Asia, now grown on a larger scale under Russian administration, travelled by rail to Russian mills instead of by camel to Chinese or Persian markets. Despite these changes, certain segments of the old routes remained active for specialised trade. Tea from China still moved northward through Mongolia to Russian Siberia because it kept better in the cooler northern climates. Horses and wool from the Kazakh steppes continued to supply both Qing and Russian armies. Small caravans of luxury items, jade carvings, fine carpets and medicinal herbs persisted where speed was less important than avoiding high-sea freight charges or customs duties at treaty ports. Local traders in Kashgar and Yarkand adapted by acting as middlemen between Russian and Chinese buyers, using the old oasis towns as warehouses and meeting points. Families that had operated caravans for generations now invested in small warehouses along the new railway lines or learned to read train timetables alongside traditional route markers. Russian administrators in Central Asia introduced modern infrastructure that benefited the remaining trade. They built telegraph lines alongside the railways, allowing merchants to send price information ahead and adjust shipments accordingly. Irrigation projects expanded cotton fields in the Fergana Valley, turning former caravan stops into rail sidings with loading platforms. Schools in the larger towns taught Russian and basic accounting to the sons of merchants, preparing them for business in a world where contracts were written on paper rather than sealed with verbal agreements. At the same time, Russian officials collected detailed statistics on trade volumes, noting that while overall tonnage had shifted to steam and rail, the value of certain luxury goods travelling by camel had actually risen because they reached niche markets faster than bulk cargo by sea. British influence in the region was more indirect but equally transformative. After the First Anglo-Afghan War in the 1840s and a second conflict in the 1870s, Britain established a resident in Kabul and maintained close relations with the Afghan emir. This allowed British Indian merchants to trade through the Khyber Pass with Central Asian partners, bringing Indian tea and cotton goods northward in exchange for Turkoman carpets and Central Asian horses. The British also sponsored surveys and explorations that mapped previously little-known routes, information that later helped both commercial and military planners. Some British officers, such as Francis Younghusband, crossed the Pamirs in the 1880s and 1890s, producing reports that described the political situation and commercial potential of the high plateaus. Archaeological interest added another layer to the region's changing role. European scholars and adventurers, inspired by accounts of ancient Silk Road travellers, began systematic excavations in the early 20th century. Aurel Stein, working for the British Museum and later the Indian government, conducted expeditions in the Tarim Basin between 1900 and 1916. He followed old caravan tracks to ruined cities buried in sand, recovering manuscripts, paintings, and everyday objects that had lain undisturbed for centuries. His finds, shipped back to London and Delhi, sparked public fascination with the Silk Road's past and encouraged further exploration. Swedish explorer Sven Hedin mapped the Taklamakan Desert and the Lop Nor region, producing books that described the harsh conditions still faced by modern travellers. These expeditions often travelled with local guides whose families had escorted caravans for generations, blending scientific work with the practical knowledge of the routes. The Qing dynasty's final decades saw a gradual opening of the western frontiers to foreign influence. Treaties signed after the Opium Wars and later conflicts allowed Russian consulates in cities like Ely and Kashgar, where merchants from both empires could register goods and settle disputes under consular protection. The 1881 Treaty of St. Petersburg adjusted borders and granted Russia trading rights in Xinjiang, leading to an increase in Russian goods flowing into Chinese markets. When the Qing fell in 1911 and the Republic of China took its place, the new government in Beijing struggled to maintain control over distant provinces. Warlords in the northwest sometimes taxed caravans heavily or requisitioned animals for their own armies, further discouraging traditional traders. Local populations adapted in quiet ways. Uyghur and Tajik families in the oases continued to offer lodging and supplies to the smaller caravans that still passed through, supplementing their income with work on the railways or in cotton fields. Women in these households managed small tea houses where travellers exchanged news from different empires, learning which passes were open and which officials demanded the lowest bribes. Children learned to distinguish the sound of a camel bell from the whistle of a distant train, growing up in a world where the old and new forms of transport coexisted side by side. Some merchant families diversified, sending one son to manage rail shipments to Russia, while another handled camel trains to remote mountain markets that railways could not reach. The cultural atmosphere of the 19th century reflected this mixture of decline and persistence. In Bukhara's covered markets, Russian samovars sat alongside Chinese porcelain, and merchants haggled in a blend of Turkic, Persian and Russian. Buddhist cave temples near Dunhuang, once rest stops for pilgrims, now served as temporary shelters for survey teams carrying cameras and notebooks. Sufi shrines in the Persian and Central Asian deserts welcomed travellers of all backgrounds, offering prayers for safe journeys that now included wishes for favourable exchange rates on the new telegraph wires. European travellers sometimes joined these caravans for parts of their route, noting in their diaries the contrast between the slow pace of camel travel and the rapid changes occurring in the cities they had left behind. By the early 20th century, the traditional caravan trade had shrunk to a fraction of its former scale, yet it had not disappeared entirely. The routes that once carried the bulk of Eurasia's commerce now served niche purposes, moving goods too fragile or too low volume for rail and sea, or connecting communities that lived far from modern transport lines. The Great Game had redrawn political maps, placing most of Central Asia under Russian or Qing influence, and turning independent khanates into provinces or protectorates. This political consolidation brought a different kind of stability. one based on imperial administration rather than the mutual interests of merchant guilds and local rulers. The human stories from this transitional time highlight the resilience of ordinary people. A caravan master in Kashgar, who had once led strings of 200 camels, now organised smaller groups of 20, using the same mountain passes his grandfather had known, but timing departures to coincide with train arrivals at the nearest railhead. A British Indian trader in Peshawar maintained ledgers that listed both camel hire rates and steamship schedules, calculating which combination would deliver Afghan wool to London markets at the lowest cost. Families in the oases preserved old route maps drawn on leather, while adding notes about new telegraph stations and border posts. These adaptations kept the ancient corridors alive, even as the world around them sped up. Environmental conditions still dictated the pace of movement in the desert and mountain sections. Sandstorms could bury rail sidings as easily as old caravan tracks, and heavy snow in the Pamirs closed passes for weeks regardless of whether travellers rode camels or rode in railway cars to the foothills. Local herders continued to supply fodder and fresh animals, maintaining economic links between nomadic and settled populations that had existed for centuries. Russian and British engineers occasionally surveyed these areas for possible rail extensions, but the high costs and difficult terrain kept many stretches dependent on traditional transport well into the 20th century. The period also saw the beginning of organised tourism and cultural preservation efforts. Wealthy Europeans and Americans, inspired by the published accounts of explorers, hired guides to retrace parts of the Silk Road for leisure. They stayed in converted caravanserais that now offered beds and European-style meals alongside the usual tea and flatbread. Local authorities in both Russian and Chinese territories recognized the potential revenue from such visitors and began to protect certain historic sites from looting. This new interest in the past helped ensure that the physical remains of the old trade routes, watchtowers, cave paintings, and ruined cities would survive for future study. As the 19th century closed and the 20th began, the Silk Road had entered its modern phase. The empires that had once risen and fallen along its length were now largely replaced by colonial administrations or weakened central governments struggling to adapt to industrial changes. Trade continued, but in altered forms and reduced volumes, the Great Game had left a legacy of detailed maps and political boundaries that would shape the region for decades. Yet the quiet movement of people and goods along the old paths persisted, carrying not only merchandise but also ideas, languages, and family connections that linked distant communities. The caravans had grown smaller and fewer, but the network they followed remained a living reminder of the long history of connection across the vast interior of Asia. Revolution, Cold War closure, and the 20th century quiet. The political upheavals of the early 20th century continued to reshape the old caravan corridors, even after the formal end of imperial rule in many regions. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed, and the new Republic of China struggled to govern the distant western provinces. Local warlords in Xinjiang often controlled the remaining trade routes, collecting their own taxes and sometimes blocking passage to favour certain merchant groups. Russian influence grew stronger after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, as the new Soviet government sought to secure its southern borders and expand economic ties with neighbouring territories. Soviet agents worked with local leaders in Central Asia to establish cooperative trading arrangements, sending cotton and minerals northward in exchange for manufactured goods from Russian factories. The creation of the Soviet Union in 1922 brought systematic changes to the Central Asian republics. The Bolsheviks nationalized many trading operations and directed resources towards state-controlled collectives rather than private caravans. Railways expanded further, linking Tashkent and Alma-Ata with Moscow and allowing bulk shipments that made long camel journeys less necessary for most goods. Border controls tightened, with passports and customs inspections required even for short crossings between Soviet territories and the Chinese side. Merchants who had once moved freely now needed official permits, and many smaller operators found the new regulations too costly or restrictive. Some families shifted their business to local markets. selling wool or dried fruits within the Soviet system rather than attempting the full journey to Chinese cities. In China, the Republican period gave way to further conflict when Japanese forces invaded in the 1930s. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek focused its resources on the Eastern Front, leaving the Northwest even more isolated. During World War II, the Soviet Union supplied some aid to China through overland routes across Xinjiang, sending trucks and aircraft parts along rough roads that followed parts of the old Silk Road paths. These shipments were limited and temporary, ending when the war concluded in 1945. The Chinese Civil War resumed afterward, and in 1949 the Communist Party established the People's Republic of China. The new government prioritized internal consolidation and socialist transformation, placing strict controls on private trade across borders. The early decades of the People's Republic saw the western regions integrated more closely into the national economy. The completion of the Lanzhou-Urumqi Railway in 1962 connected Xinjiang directly to eastern China by rail, reducing reliance on traditional caravan routes for internal transport. State farms and factories in the northwest produced goods for domestic use, while border trade with the Soviet Union operated under government agreements rather than individual merchant initiative. Cross-border movement became highly regulated, with only approved state enterprises allowed to conduct limited exchanges. The ideological differences that emerged between China and the Soviet Union in the late 1950s led to the Sino-Soviet split, closing most remaining economic links along the shared frontier. Patrols increased, and the once active passes through the Tian Shan and Altai Mountains saw little civilian traffic. The Cold War atmosphere turned much of Central Asia into a zone of strategic competition rather than commerce. The Soviet Union developed its Central Asian republics as industrial and agricultural bases, building cities, universities, and irrigation systems that transformed local economies. Cotton production in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan grew under centralized planning, with output shipped by rail to Soviet textile mills. On the Chinese side, the government encouraged settlement in Xinjiang by Han Chinese migrants and promoted heavy industry in places like Karamai. Trade between the two sides dropped to minimal levels, limited to occasional barter deals arranged at the state level. Nomadic herders who had once guided caravans across the steppes now worked within collective farms or state enterprises. Their traditional knowledge of the routes preserved mainly in family stories rather than daily practice. Cultural and religious life in the region adapted to the new political realities. In the Soviet republics, authorities promoted secular education and discouraged certain religious practices, though local traditions continued in private settings. Mosques and madrasas in Bukhara and Samarkand operated under state oversight, and many historic buildings were preserved as museums or tourist sites for visitors from within the Soviet bloc. In China, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s brought campaigns against old customs, affecting temples, shrines, and traditional merchant practices in the northwest. Many cave sites and ancient structures suffered damage during this period, though some local communities quietly protected important locations. After the reforms that began in the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping, economic activity increased. But cross-border trade remained limited until political relations improved. Small-scale exchanges never stopped entirely. Kazakh and Kyrgyz herders living near the borders sometimes traded livestock or handicrafts informally with communities on the other side, using mountain paths known only to locals. Uyghur families in Kashgar maintained contacts with relatives in Soviet Central Asia through letters and occasional visits when permits allowed. These personal networks kept a thin thread of connection alive, passing along recipes, songs, and practical skills, even when official trade was frozen. In the 1980s, as relations between China and the Soviet Union began to thaw, limited border markets reopened under strict supervision. Traders from both sides met at designated points to exchange consumer goods. With Chinese light manufactures moving westward and Soviet machinery or raw materials coming eastward in small quantities, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 created new independent states in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. These countries faced the challenge of building national economies after decades of central planning. Borders that had been internal Soviet lines now became international frontiers, requiring new customs procedures and passports. The sudden opening allowed a modest revival of private trade. Merchants from China began travelling to Almaty and Bishkek with consumer goods, while Central Asian traders brought raw materials and agricultural products to markets in Urumqi and Kashgar. New bus services and improved roads facilitated shorter journeys, though the full overland route to Europe remained impractical for most private operators because of poor infrastructure and political uncertainties. International organizations and neighboring countries explored ways to reconnect the region. The Asian Development Bank supported projects to improve road and rail links across Central Asia, aiming to create modern transport corridors that could link the landlocked states to global markets. China participated in these discussions, seeing potential for its own western provinces to benefit from better connections. In the 1990s and early 2000s, energy resources became a major focus. Pipelines carried oil and gas from Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan to China, following routes that roughly paralleled ancient caravan paths but used modern technology for continuous flow rather than seasonal transport. These projects brought investment and jobs to the region, while tying the economies more closely together. Daily life in the oasis towns and border cities reflected the gradual shift from isolation to limited openness. Markets in Kashgar once again featured stalls with goods from multiple countries, though the volume remained modest compared to coastal ports. Families that had worked in state enterprises began to open small shops or transport businesses, using trucks instead of camels for local hauls. Young people learned Russian or English in addition to their native languages, preparing for opportunities in cross-border commerce or tourism. Historic sites started to attract visitors from within China and from the new Central Asian republics, with some old caravanserais restored as cultural centres or simple guest houses. Environmental conditions in the region continued to influence activity. Desertification and water shortages affected farming in the Tarim Basin, prompting government projects to improve irrigation and plant shelter belts. In the mountain areas, melting glaciers altered water flows, requiring new management agreements between neighbouring states. These practical challenges reminded residents that the land still shaped movement, even when modern vehicles replaced pack animals. By the early years of the 21st century, the old Silk Road corridors had become quiet backwaters in global commerce. Most international trade moved by sea or by air, with rail and road links serving mainly regional needs. Yet the physical infrastructure of roads, railways and pipelines that followed the general direction of the ancient routes provided a foundation for something larger. Governments in the region recognized the potential value of their geographic position between major economic centers. China, with its growing economy and interest in secure energy supplies and new markets, began to look westward with fresh attention. Central Asian leaders saw opportunities to reduce their dependence on any single partner by developing multiple connections. The human legacy of the earlier trade eras remained visible in the languages spoken, the foods prepared, and the architectural styles of old city quarters. Elders in Bukhara or Turfan could still describe the routes their grandparents had known, pointing out passes or wells that no longer appeared on modern maps. Younger generations studied the history in school, learning about Jiang Qian, Marco Polo, and the great empires that had once depended on these paths. This shared memory created a sense of regional identity that transcended the new national borders. The 20th century had closed most of the traditional caravan traffic, replacing it with state-directed exchanges and modern transport. Ideological divisions, world wars, and the priorities of industrial economies had pushed the overland routes into the background. Yet the corridors themselves endured as lines on the map and as lived spaces where people continued to move, trade, and connect in smaller ways. The quiet persistence of these links set the stage for renewed interest when larger economic forces and political visions turned attention back to the interior of the continent. The old network, though diminished, had never been completely erased, and its physical traces and cultural echoes provided a ready framework for those who would later propose building upon it once again. The Belt and Road Initiative and the Modern Revival. The turn of the 21st century brought a new chapter when China's economy grew rapidly after the reforms of the late 1970s. By the 2010s, Chinese leaders looked for ways to secure energy supplies, open new markets, and connect the less developed Western regions more closely with the rest of the country and with neighbouring states. In September 2013, during a speech at Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan, President Xi Jinping proposed the Silk Road economic belt. A month later, in Indonesia, he spoke of a companion 21st century maritime Silk Road. Together, these ideas formed the Belt and Road Initiative, a broad framework for building infrastructure, improving trade, and strengthening economic ties across dozens of countries. The plan revived the old name of the Silk Road, but this time the connections would rely on highways, railways, ports, pipelines, and digital links rather than camel caravans. The overland component, often called the Belt, focused on 6 main corridors that roughly followed the historic routes through Central Asia. One key path ran from western China through Kazakhstan, Russia, and into Europe. Another crossed Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan before linking with routes toward Iran and Turkey. Chinese state-owned companies and banks provided much of the financing for new roads, high-speed rail lines, and border facilities. In Kazakhstan, the government welcomed the projects because they offered a way to move oil and minerals more efficiently to Chinese markets and to position the country as a transit hub between East and West. Similar agreements were signed with Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and other Central Asian states, where leaders saw opportunities for investment in their own infrastructure. Construction moved quickly in some areas. The China-Europe Railway Express began regular service in 2011 and expanded after the Belt and Road announcement. Container trains now leave from cities like Chongqing and Xi'an, travel through Kazakhstan and Russia, or through Central Asia and the Caspian region, and reach destinations in Germany, Poland, and Spain in about 2 weeks. These trains carry electronics, auto parts, clothing, and machinery westward, returning with European cars, wine, and medical equipment. The volume grew from a few dozen trains per year to thousands, demonstrating that modern rail could handle significant cargo volumes across the continent in a fraction of the time once required by caravans. At the same time, road projects widened existing highways and built new ones through mountain passes, allowing trucks to move goods that needed more flexible scheduling than trains. Energy infrastructure formed another important part. Pipelines from Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan now deliver natural gas and oil directly to Western China, reducing reliance on sea shipments through the Strait of Malacca. These lines run parallel to older caravan routes in many sections, using the same mountain gaps and river valleys that travellers had followed for centuries. In Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor includes roads, power plants, and a deep-water port at Gwadar, linking western China to the Arabian Sea and providing an alternative southern outlet. Similar projects in Iran and Turkey aim to connect the overland network with Mediterranean ports. The initiative also includes agreements on customs procedures, visa rules, and digital connectivity. Countries along the routes have simplified border crossings for freight, introduced electronic documentation, and in some cases aligned technical standards for rail gauges and safety regulations. China has offered training programs for officials and technicians from partner countries, helping them manage the new facilities. At the same time, concerns have been raised about debt levels in some participating nations and about the environmental impact of large construction projects in sensitive desert and mountain areas. Governments have responded by adjusting terms and adding environmental reviews to later phases of work. Local communities along the revived corridors have experienced direct changes. In Kashgar and Korgos on the Chinese side, New free trade zones and logistics parks have created jobs in warehousing, transport and services. Truck drivers and rail workers now move goods that once travelled by camel, while small businesses supply food, fuel and lodging to the crews. In Almaty and Tashkent, markets once again see a steady flow of Chinese consumer goods alongside local products heading eastward. Families that preserved stories of their ancestors' caravan trade sometimes find new roles, guiding tour groups or working in cultural heritage projects tied to the initiative. Younger people study logistics, engineering, and foreign languages to participate in the expanded economy. Tourism has grown alongside commerce. Travellers from China and other countries visit restored sections of the old Silk Road, staying in modern hotels built near historic sites such as the Mughal caves or the ruins of ancient cities in Uzbekistan. Some tours follow the exact paths described in historical accounts, using buses or jeeps instead of camels but stopping at the same oases for rest. These visitors learn about the region's layered past while contributing to local economies through spending on guides, meals, and souvenirs. Cultural festivals in cities like Samarkand and Dunhuang celebrate the shared heritage, featuring music, dance, and food from multiple traditions that once met along the routes. The maritime component of the initiative complements the land corridors by developing port facilities in Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Africa, and Europe. Chinese companies have helped upgrade or build ports in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Djibouti, and Greece, creating a network that allows goods to move smoothly between sea and land routes. A manufacturer in Chongqing can ship parts by rail to a Central Asian hub, then continue by sea from a Persian Gulf port, or send finished products directly by train to Duisburg in Germany. This combined approach offers flexibility and resilience when one route faces delays from weather, politics, or maintenance. International reactions have varied. Many governments in Asia, Africa, and Europe have signed memorandums of understanding and participated in forums hosted by China. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, launched in 2016, provides additional financing alongside traditional institutions like the World Bank. At the same time, some countries and analysts have expressed caution about strategic influence, transparency of contracts, and the balance between economic benefits and political ties. These discussions have led to adjustments in project terms and greater emphasis on local participation in planning. Environmental considerations have become more prominent as construction advances. Projects now often include measures to protect water resources in arid zones, reduce dust in desert areas, and minimize disruption to wildlife migration paths in the mountains. Chinese and partner country scientists conduct joint studies on sustainable development along the corridors, drawing lessons from centuries of human adaptation to the same landscapes. In some places, solar and wind power installations support the new infrastructure, providing cleaner energy for rail yards and logistics centres. The human dimension remains central. Truck drivers on the new highways share stories with colleagues from different countries at rest stops, much as caravan merchants once did around campfires. Engineers from Beijing work alongside local teams in Dushanbe or Astana, exchanging technical knowledge while learning about regional customs. Families in border towns host visitors from partner nations, preparing meals that blend Chinese, Central Asian, and sometimes European ingredients. Children in schools along the routes study maps that show both the ancient Silk Road and the modern corridors, learning that their region sits at the centre of a renewed network of connection. By the late 2010s and into the 2020s, the Belt and Road Initiative had become a major feature of global infrastructure development. Hundreds of projects were underway or completed, involving more than 140 countries and international organisations. Trade volumes along the land corridors continued to rise, though still far below the scale of maritime shipping. The initiative also spurred related efforts in digital connectivity, with fibre optic cables and data centres following similar geographic paths to support e-commerce and communication. The revival did not restore the exact conditions of earlier centuries. Modern transport moves containers rather than individual bolts of silk, and decisions are made by governments and large companies rather than independent merchants. Yet the fundamental idea remains similar, using the geography of Central Asia to link distant economies for mutual benefit. The old caravan routes provided the mental and sometimes the physical map for these new projects. Ancient passes through the Pamirs or the Tian Shan now carry high-voltage power lines or paved highways, while railway tracks run near the dried beds of rivers that once guided travellers. Political and economic shifts continue to influence progress. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 temporarily slowed construction and trade, but rail services resumed quickly as an alternative to congested sea routes. Geopolitical tensions have led some countries to review their level of participation, while others have deepened involvement through additional agreements. The initiative has also inspired competing proposals, such as the European Union's Global Gateway and the United States' Build Back Better world effort, creating a broader international focus on infrastructure in developing regions. In the western Chinese provinces, the effects have been visible in daily life. Urumqi has grown into a major logistics centre, with new airports and rail terminals. Smaller towns along the corridors have seen improved roads, schools and hospitals funded through related development programs. Farmers in oasis areas supply fresh produce to the growing population of workers and travellers. The cultural atmosphere mixes tradition with modernity. Evening markets in Kashgar sell both handmade carpets and imported electronics, while musicians perform old Silk Road melodies on instruments updated with contemporary amplification. Central Asian capitals have experienced similar transformations. New office buildings and hotels in Astana and Tashkent host international conferences on trade and connectivity. Universities offer courses in logistics and international relations, preparing students for careers in the expanded networks. Rural communities near the routes benefit from better access to markets for their livestock and crops. Though challenges remain in balancing development with preservation of traditional ways of life, the modern revival has also brought renewed scholarly and public interest in the historical Silk Road. Museums in China, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have opened or expanded exhibits featuring artifacts from earlier eras alongside displays about current projects. Books, documentaries and exhibitions trace the continuity from Jiang Qian's missions to today's container trains. This awareness helps build public support for the initiative by connecting it to a shared regional heritage that predates modern nation-states. As the third decade of the 21st century progresses, the Belt and Road corridors continue to evolve. Some projects have faced delays or renegotiations, while others have exceeded expectations in volume and impact. The core vision of using land connections to complement maritime trade has taken concrete form in steel rails, asphalt roads, and energy pipelines that span the continent. The ancient idea of linking east and west through the interior of Asia has found new expression suited to the needs and technologies of the current age. The people who live and work along these revived routes carry forward the fron, practical spirit of earlier travellers. They calculate costs and schedules, negotiate with authorities, and adapt to changing conditions, just as merchants and guides did centuries ago. The scale is larger and the pace faster, but the underlying purpose remains the same, moving goods, ideas, and opportunities across vast distances to improve lives at both ends of the journey. In this way, the Silk Road, once carried on the backs of camels and the shoulders of men, now travels on wheels, rails, and cables, yet still serves as a bridge between distant societies in an interconnected world. The corridors that had grown through years of steady construction and careful adjustment stood by the later part of the decade as a functioning network that linked manufacturing centres in East Asia with markets in Europe, resource regions in Central Asia and Africa, and ports along multiple sea routes. Rail services operated on predictable schedules, moving containers of electronics, machinery, clothing, and specialty foods in both directions. Energy lines delivered oil, gas, and increasing amounts of renewable power to support industries and households across wide areas. Digital systems allowed real-time coordination of shipments, customs clearance, and market information, reducing the uncertainties that once made long-distance trade a high-risk venture. These elements work together to form a practical system suited to the scale and speed of contemporary economies, while still following the broad geographic outlines that had guided travellers since the time of the Han dynasty. Trade. Volumes reflected the accumulated impact of these links. The China-Europe Railway Express and related services carried millions of 20-foot equivalent units annually, with growth continuing even when global conditions introduced new tariffs or supply disruptions. Central Asian republics maintained strong commercial ties with China, exchanging energy resources and raw materials for manufactured goods and technology. Projects in metals processing, renewable energy, and logistics created jobs and added value in regions that had previously depended mainly on raw exports. The wider involvement of African and Middle Eastern countries added further balance, allowing resources and finished products to move along complementary paths that reduced dependence on any single corridor. The emphasis on sustainability had become an integral part of operations rather than an afterthought. Solar and wind installations in desert and steppe areas supplied clean power to rail yards, warehouses, and nearby communities. Water management practices improved through joint monitoring and the restoration of traditional irrigation methods alongside modern techniques. Road and rail construction incorporated measures to protect wildlife corridors and stabilize fragile soils. These steps helped ensure that the increased movement of goods and people did not exhaust the natural systems that had supported human activity in these landscapes for centuries. The Green Silk Road had evolved from a concept into a working reality that shaped daily decisions at project sites and policy meetings alike. People-to-people connections provided the social foundation that kept the network resilient. Students who had studied together maintained contact through professional networks and shared projects. Families in border towns hosted travellers and workers from partner countries, exchanging meals, stories, and practical advice. Railway crews from different nations coordinated operations with a blend of technical routines and personal rapport built over repeated journeys. Cultural events in historic cities drew participants who arrived by modern transport, yet walked the same routes once followed by merchants and monks. These human threads turned the corridors into more than arteries for cargo. They became pathways where individuals from distant places met, learned, and formed relationships that endured beyond any single shipment or contract. The long history of the Silk Road offered a useful perspective on the changes of the current era. Earlier periods had seen the routes rise and fall with the fortunes of empires, the invention of new transport methods, and shifts in global demand. The Han expansion, the Mongol unification, the Tang Golden Age, the Timurid revival, and the modern industrial transformations each brought different forms of connection while facing their own challenges of politics, environment, and technology. The network had never remained static. It had always adapted through the practical efforts of merchants, officials, travellers, and local communities who found ways to keep goods and ideas moving despite obstacles. The contemporary corridors followed the same pattern, absorbing pressures from trade tensions, debt concerns, and environmental limits while continuing to serve their core purpose. Looking forward, the network appeared likely to keep evolving, rather than reaching any final shape. Advances in electric and autonomous freight transport could lower costs and emissions further. Expanded digital services might open participation to even smaller businesses and remote communities. Continued emphasis on skills development and technology transfer would help ensure that benefits spread more widely. At the same time, the physical geography of Central Asia would remain a constant, channeling movement through the same mountain passes, river valleys, and oasis chains that had shaped trade for over 2 millennia. The combination of ancient roots and modern capabilities created a foundation that could support further growth while remaining responsive to changing global needs. The human dimension would continue to matter most. The drivers, engineers, farmers, students, and families whose daily work and lives intersected with the corridors carried forward the same spirit of practical cooperation that had sustained the Silk Road through every previous era. They calculated routes and schedules, negotiated terms, solved problems on the ground, and built relationships that crossed borders and cultures. In doing so, they kept alive the quiet continuity of exchange that had first linked distant civilizations when Jiang Qian returned from his Western mission more than 2,000 years ago. The story of the Silk Road is ultimately a story of ordinary people making choices that connected larger worlds. Merchants risked long journeys for profit and discovery. Rulers balanced security with the revenue that safe passage brought. Monks and scholars carried ideas alongside goods. Families adapted their lives to the rhythms of arrival and departure. In every age, the route succeeded when cooperation outweighed conflict, and when practical benefits encouraged openness. The modern revival has followed the same logic, using new tools and larger scales yet resting on the same human foundations. As the decade draws toward its close, the corridors stand as a living bridge across continents and across time. They carry containers and data where once camel bells sounded. They transmit power from sun and wind where travellers once sought scarce wells. They link classrooms and festivals where earlier meetings happened around campfires. The scale has grown and the pace has quickened, but the essential purpose endures: to move resources, knowledge, and opportunities so that distant societies can meet their needs and enrich one another. The ancient network that began with tentative threads of silk and information has become a multifaceted system of rail, road, pipe, cable, and human connection. It has weathered empires, technologies, and global shifts because it has always served a basic human impulse to reach beyond immediate horizons. In the present day, it continues to do so, adapting to new realities while preserving the geographic and cultural memory of the paths that first joined East and West. The Silk Road, in all its forms, reminds us that connection across vast distances is possible when people choose to build and maintain it. The corridors of today, like those of the past, depend on the daily efforts of countless individuals who keep the routes open, the goods moving, and the conversations alive. Their work sustains a bridge that has lasted for centuries and that still carries the quiet promise of shared futures across the heart of the continent. As the lights of distant cities flicker along the rail lines and the wind moves through turbine blades in the steppes, the long journey of exchange continues in its latest chapter. The threads that once bound civilizations through patience and endurance now weave through steel and silicon, yet they still tie humanity together in the same enduring pattern of movement, adaptation, and mutual benefit.